Hello, young adults. Welcome those of you at the Birch Building and those watching in various locations to the special devotional meeting tonight. This gathering is combined meeting of Wednesday Institute night for Boise Nampa Institute, as well as pilot program featuring Brother Keith Erekson, the director of the church library in Salt Lake City. We are grateful for all those who have chosen to be with us. Um, Elder Zachary F. Evans, Area 70 here in the Treasure Valley, is presiding at this meeting. My name is David Martinez, and I am the Vice President in the Latter-day Saints Student Association here at the Nampa campus, and I have been asked to conduct. We will begin by singing one verse of hymn 301, I'm a Child of God. Alyssa Davenport will be our pianist, and Christopher Allen will be our chorister. Following the hymn, our opening prayer will be given by Tim Lamb.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you here who are with us in the building, and those who are on Zoom. I was watching you enter the waiting room, and so I'm glad that you're here. I want to answer your questions tonight. Anything you ever wanted to ask, go for it. While you formulate your thoughts, I want to just share a little bit about what I do each day, and that may help you as you think about what you want to say or what you want to ask. I've got a statement here by Elder Russell Nelson. He made this statement 30 years ago, and he said, "Our youth are wonderful and especially able to ask thoughtful questions." Now, I'm not sure what he meant by youth, but he was 60 when he made this statement. So if you're over 60, please stay quiet. Under 60, we'll look forward to your thoughtful questions that you can answer. Asking questions is an important part of being a disciple of Jesus Christ. We don't often talk about it this way, but it really is. Elder Uchtdorf said, "We are a question-asking people. We have always been, because we know that inquiry leads to truth." Now, the reason he can say we have always been a question-asking people is the restoration of the gospel in the latter days began with a question. It began with Joseph's question. You read the New Testament, I think there's no teaching repeated more frequently by the Savior than the instruction to ask, seek, knock, come unto me. He says it so many ways, but he's begging us to inquire and to learn. And so that's part of being a disciple of Jesus Christ, is to have questions and to wonder and to learn about them. So I'm the director of the Church History Library. This is the place where it's basically the archive of the church. This is where we keep the records of the church itself. So Joseph Smith's journals are in the Church History Library, the minutes of the First Presidency, your patriarchal blessing, if the patriarch sent it to headquarters, is here in the Church History Library collection. This is where we keep everything about the church: property records, records of missionaries, backup copies of membership records. Everything the church does for which there are records or information, we store them in the Church History Library. Now, I am also, in this role, one of only 3 people on the planet who have access to the church's high security storage vault. That's right, we have a high security storage vault. Some of the things in our collection are literally worth millions of dollars. And so we have to keep them safe. So the 3 people who can access the vault, the other 2 work for me. They're 2 of my employees. So what do I do if President Nelson walks in and says, "Hey, Keith, I'd like to see something in the vault"? Well, the first thing I do is verify his identity. I've seen too many movies where you just walk in and pretend you're somebody. But once I'm certain that it is President Nelson, I would let him in. Now, he's never come over and asked to come in. Usually it works the other way around. He'll ask us to pull something out and we'll take it over for him to look at or other people to see. But there's another thing in our collection that you might be surprised to know about. We have, the simplest way to say it, we have the world's largest collection of anti-Mormon materials. Did you know that? And actually, there's a reason in Scripture why we do this. You know, some people read the Scriptures and say, oh, that's nice, it makes me feel good. We actually read the Doctrine and Covenants and say, oh no, we better do that. And this is one of those places. This is right after the saints were expelled from Missouri. They are instructed to gather up records of all of the things that happened to them. And you can see some of the adjectives here. We're supposed to collect things that are libelous. And this is one of my favorite lines in all of Scripture. If you can ever weave this into a talk, just say something is the whole concatenation of diabolical rascality and nefarious and murderous impositions. That's what we collect. Magazines, encyclopedias, newspapers. In the 21st century, this includes websites, blogs, YouTube videos. We gather these things because it's part of what we're supposed to collect. Now, why am I telling you this? One of the reasons I'm telling you this is a lot of times when we encounter questions that we haven't heard before, or topics, or we start to wonder things, one of the ways we're immediately tempted to think about it is, oh no, I've discovered something that no one else knows about. Just me and the 1,000 people on this Reddit are the only people who know this deep diabolical secret. And I'm telling you, no, we know about it. President Nelson knows about it. Most of the things that you find on the internet today were in pamphlets and articles 100 years ago. There aren't a lot of new ideas about what's wrong with the church. And they all have answers. That's really what I want. One of the things I hope that we can share with tonight. You don't have to worry that something hasn't known or doesn't have an answer. Let's talk about that. Well, a couple other things I do in my role. I am the official project historian for the Salt Lake Temple renovation. So that means I don't do anything engineering-wise. That's for engineers. But I go around and keep track of the records as we record what's going on here. I serve on the editorial board of the Church Historians Press. This is the group that publishes Saints and the Joseph Smith papers, a variety of other things. In fact, today we launched an online publication. We're going to publish many of the sermons, the discourses of Eliza R. Snow. And so we put up the webpage today, our first batch, first 2 years of her discourses. She was an amazing leader, amazing speaker. For decades, she traveled throughout the church and built the kingdom. And so these are really fantastic sermons, and we're excited. We'll be publishing them in batches over the next several years, but today was the very first day. And then I've worked for the church for 6 years. Before that, I was a history professor at the University of Texas. I did some things in the administration. Way before that, I worked in the auto industry. So I do have an MBA. I have a PhD in history. That's kind of my work life. Published things about Abraham Lincoln. I was the guy who discovered that the Elvis Presley Book of Mormon was a forgery. So if that was something your testimony was hanging on, I'm sorry. We can find another way around that, I'm sure. You're far enough away. When I'm down in Utah, sometimes I have to be careful about this, but you're far enough away from the University of Utah. Is it okay if I talk about the University of Utah? So last fall, I taught this course at the University of Utah in their history department called Hoaxes and History. And we had a lot of fun just going into hoaxes, forgeries, some of the great things, great kind of swindles and frauds in history. So that's a little bit about kind of me and what I do. And I'm really, I guess the last thing I'll say which is probably the most important. I am a dad. I have 4 daughters. I was a girl dad way before that was a hashtag. And so about every other night, literally with 4 daughters, I swear, every other night, the conversation at dinner is something about, why do men make more than women? They're so stupid. And so, seriously, I care very much about my daughters, about their future, their education, their rights. I'm definitely a feminist in that context of wanting the world to be fair and equitable for everybody who participates. So maybe this is the last slide I'll talk about before I take a question. I'll, as just a preface about how I want to talk about history. I'm not going to talk about it tonight the way that you probably talked about it in school. In school, there's usually just one answer. There's a textbook. You read it, you memorize it, you put it, you regurgitate it back on the test. In real life, what I do every day with history, it's almost the total opposite. There's not one story. There are lots of stories and voices. There's not one source. There are many sources. Some of them contradict each other. Some of them, multiple sources by the same person, contradict themselves. And so we don't memorize stuff in the real world of doing history. We're thinking, we're exploring, we're looking, we're wondering. And so as we talk about whatever you want to talk about tonight, I may also give you a framework to help you kind of think through some of the things we're talking about. So with that, I'm going to get off this podium. Is that all right? They told me if I push this button, then you can keep hearing me if I walk around. And I'll put this on. We tested it. It's supposed to work if I have this on. Is that working? So, what do you want to know? What do you want to ask? Right here, first hand up. I'll kind of come around close so I can hear.
All right, so why do we have that specific account of the first vision in the Pearl of Great Price? I know there's many accounts.
Great question.
So why do we have that?
So there are many accounts of the first vision, which is a good thing. So why do we just have one in the Pearl of Great Price? Maybe I'll say a little bit about the other accounts because it kind of sets up the one. So we like to separate the accounts into kind of 2, maybe 3 groups. The first group, there are 4 in this group, are accounts that were made by Joseph Smith. He's either the author or he dictated it for a letter or something, but it's Joseph Smith's record. The one in the Pearl of Great Price is one of these 4. So we'll kind of come back to that grouping in a second. The second grouping are people who heard Joseph speak, and then they went somewhere and wrote in their own journal or a letter and said, oh, today Joseph was giving a sermon and he talked about his vision, and then they wrote something. So these are one step removed. They heard Joseph, but they were, the words are the person who went home that night and wrote in their journal or summarized it in a letter to their family member. We have 5 of those that have survived. So 4 that Joseph created, 5 from people who heard him and recorded it quickly. The third group are people who many years later, sometimes 40 years later, will say, oh yeah, when I was a boy, I was in Nauvoo and I heard Joseph say something. That's even one step further removed. The person was probably there, but if it's 40 years later and they're trying to remember, we just have less confidence. We'll probably have confidence in the general story, but we have less confidence in the exact words, that these were the words that Joseph said. So back to the 4, to the Pearl of Great Price question. The first one, produced by Joseph, he wrote in his personal history. And it's in his own handwriting. It's the only one in his handwriting.
And he never published it. He wrote it, he kept it, he put it in a file and never shared it. And it actually wasn't discovered in the church's collection until the 1960s. And so that was the story of that one. The second one came a few years later, and it was Joseph actually had a scribe who wrote in his journal. I would be a great journal keeper if I had somebody writing my journal for me. So we have one day his scribe was there. Joseph was giving a little kind of conversation with a person in Kirtland, 1835, and the scribe recorded it. And that was in Joseph's journal. His journals are handwritten. There are 11 volumes. And when the Saints crossed the plains, they stuck his journals in a trunk, in a wagon. They came to Salt Lake, and we didn't really unpack all of the stuff until, again, this was the 1950s, 1960s. And then it was a handwritten journal. You couldn't full text search. You couldn't instantly find. So it took a while to realize, oh, wow, here in his 1835 journal, the scribe captured one of these accounts. The third one is the one that ended up in the Pearl of Great Price. After 1838, Joseph started to write a history. And then this is what opens. He says, the church had been around for 8 years. Joseph says, there are so many falsehoods out there. I need to set the record straight. And he sets out to write a history, and that's the version, or that's the account that he does. The fourth one comes a few years later in a letter that Joseph dictates. A newspaper editor in Illinois asks, oh, hey, tell me about your church. Joseph responds and tells the first vision as part of that. So that third one that was in the history got published in the newspaper in Nauvoo. And then in 1850, so it gets published during Joseph's lifetime, 1842. 8 years later, members of the 12 are in England, and they say, we need to make a pamphlet for people to learn the thing. Joseph had been dead for 6 years. They say, we need to share the wonderful things that Joseph taught. And so members of the 12 in England had copies of the Nauvoo newspaper, and they went through and plucked out kind of the things they thought were the best. So they picked out the first vision, they picked out the book of Abraham, they picked out the book of Moses, they picked out part of the Joseph Smith translation. Do you recognize what I'm talking about? Members of the 12 assembled the Pearl of Great Price while they were in England, and it was a pamphlet that they published in 1851. And then in 1880, the church sustained the Pearl of Great Price as one of the standard works. So that was kind of the pathway. He had prepared it. It got published in the newspaper. The Quorum of the 12 picked it up in the pamphlet, and then it became one of the standard works. And so that's how that one account became probably the more famous one, the one that more people know, because it was right there in the standard works. Great question. Next question. Right here.
What piece of history had caused you to question the church, or what piece of doctrine did you have concerns with, and how did you resolve it?
That's a great question. I think every disciple of Jesus Christ, his question is if I had something that caused me concern that I had to wrestle with. I think every disciple of Jesus Christ has to do that. We live in a weird world. We're trying to be like the Savior. Not everything makes sense, and we wrestle with things. Probably the one that was the toughest for me, personally, came while I was in my doctoral program. And there was kind of two layers of it. One layer was as I was studying American history, and I was taking several courses. I was also a teaching assistant for a course. But the issue that I was dealing with was race and racism and racial inequality and slavery and segregation and Jim Crow. I mean, on and on. Lynchings. And I was really weighed down by that. And of course, when we think about Latter-day Saint history, we have touch points with slavery, with different ways of discriminating against people of color. And so I kind of was working on both of those. They kind of came at the same time. I'm thinking about the big question of U.S. history. I'm thinking about my own personal question about church history. And I remember the day. There was an actual day. I was walking across campus. It was winter, so there were no leaves. But I look up through the kind of the barren trees, and I'm talking out loud to myself because there's no one on campus in winter. And I just actually talked to the heavens, and I said, why? I just don't get it. Why would you let all of this happen? These are all your children. Why? And nothing happened. The heavens didn't speak back. The trees didn't shake. But very shortly thereafter, when I was reading in the Pearl of Great Price, I was in chapter 7 of Moses. And there's a story there where Enoch, and this is the prophet who's going to make Zion, and his whole civilization is going to be lifted up and spared. But before they do that, Jehovah gives Enoch a vision. And Enoch sees the future history of the world. So he sees his people lifted up, but then he sees what happens after they're gone. The world gets so wicked that God destroys everyone in the flood except for 8 people. And when Enoch sees that, he asks the same question I did. And he's kind of upset. He's like, wow, you created all these people and they're just wicked and they're killing each other and what's going on? And Enoch had the same question, but Enoch turns in the vision and he looks at Jehovah, and what's Jehovah doing? Jehovah is weeping, and it surprises Enoch. Enoch says, whoa, I didn't think you would weep. Why are you weeping? You're Jehovah, you're all powerful. And then Jehovah says, these are my children. I've created them. I've given them their agency. They do things to harm each other, to kill each other. And I weep. And then Enoch weeps. Enoch, and he says, I refuse to be comforted. This is too much. I can't bear. Enoch got a glimpse of the weeping of the Lord. And that's where I felt a glimpse, probably much smaller than Enoch's, that the Lord does know about all of these inequalities, all of the challenges. He weeps with them. I began to see, as I read the scriptures, other stories then, places where Jesus weeps with people. Lazarus dies, and Jesus shows up late, and Lazarus' sisters scold Jesus, right? They say, if you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. What does Jesus do? He doesn't just say, oh, don't worry about it. I'm going to bring him back from the dead. What does he do? He weeps. He weeps with Mary and Martha. There are promises in the book of Revelation that when Jesus comes, he will wipe away all of our tears. And for me, it was that insight that helped me to think about, yeah, there's inequality. Yeah, there's oppression and torture and war and every evil thing in the world. But God knows, and he weeps. And I find peace in his love for me and in his tears. People talk about that you should look for the hand of God in history, and you should. But one of the takeaways I had from there was that you should also look for the tears of God in history. And so, thanks for asking. Here in the back. All right. Okay. He asked, how long has the high security vault been there? 10 years. The library building was built in 2009, and it was part of it. So we just celebrated the 10-year birthday of the building this year. No, actually, it was last year. I just worked at home in my basement this year. It was 2019. So it's 11 years. It's 11 years old. Next question. Right here.
I would love to hear your take on the Book of Abraham and kind of in correlation with Kinderhook plates, like how
Oh, okay.
needed actual papyrus. It wasn't directly what it was said to be. Same with Kinderhook plates. I just love.
Great. So she got a double question about the Book of Abraham and about the Kinderhook plates. So, Book of Abraham. Here's probably, in my mind, the most important thing to remember about the Book of Abraham. Oh, she just wanted me to give my take on the Abraham and Kinderhook plates and kind of where they came from and why we would need them. Yeah, so here's the best thing to think about for the papyrus. This is one of those places I talk about in history where we're missing things and we don't know things. So Joseph in Kirtland buys scrolls, multiple, and we don't know how many. So he has multiple scrolls, and then he says on one of them were writings of Abraham. Okay, so here's what's missing. After Joseph finished the translation, he gave the scrolls away. They didn't keep them. Our best guess is that they ended up in Chicago, from Nauvoo, Illinois, end up in Chicago, and that they were burned. There was a fire in Chicago in 1871, and as we track the materials, that's our best guess. Now, almost 100 years later, in 1967, 10 little fragments surfaced in a museum in New York City, and they were eventually identified and conveyed to the church. So those fragments are now in the church history library. They're digitized, they're online, you can see all 10 of them. But here's what's missing. We don't know how many scrolls there were. We could guess, about how long scrolls were. We've done, it wasn't carbon dating, but it was another form of dating. We've dated the scrolls to about 300 BC. Which is okay. Papyrus doesn't last long. Nobody would anticipate that these were the things that Abraham wrote on. They would have to be copies of a copy of a copy over time. But this particular copy is from about 300 BC. So we could make guesses. Scrolls at 300 BC are so long, so wide. We don't know how many scrolls there were, and we don't know where the 10 pieces that we have fit within the whole set of scrolls. So the 10 pieces have been studied multiple times by Egyptologists. Again, they're online, anybody can look at them. And the Egyptologists translate them, and they say, there's nothing here on these 10 fragments from the book of from Abraham or about Abraham. They describe them as funerary texts, things that people would just put in their coffin or their tomb as part of their kind of ritual texts about, life and righteousness or goodness and things. But they say these 10 fragments are not the things that are in the Latter-day Saint Book of Abraham. So one of the ways that people will spin this, antagonistic writers or something will say, look, they're just funerary texts. They're not what's in the Book of Abraham. That's true, but it's also not very precise. The precise answer is we have 10 fragments of an unknown number of scrolls. Somewhere on those scrolls were the things that triggered Joseph Smith's translation experience. And we don't totally know how they all fit together. So that's probably the sense on the Book of Abraham. Well, there were people who watched Joseph translate, and they left us a little bit of information. One of the things they told us, he didn't use a seer stone. Some of the witnesses would say, we saw him there, he didn't have a seer stone like the Book of Mormon translation project. The other thing that survived, and we just published these about 2 years ago in the Joseph Smith papers, for the Book of Abraham, which is different than the Book of Mormon and different than the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible project, For the book of Abraham, Joseph kept a notebook. And we have this, we've scanned the whole thing, published this online. And so in his notebook, there's an Egyptian symbol, and then there's a little descriptive interpretation as he's trying to work through the symbols. Now, people have gone through every single symbol in the notebook it's smaller in volume, much fewer words than the words that are in the book of Abraham. So we can't even make the link and say, oh, in Joseph's notes, we have everything. In Joseph's notes, we have basically him working out, trying to learn Egyptian. So the interesting tie-in here to the Kinderhook plates. Kinderhook plates, I'm glad you asked. This is one of my favorite forgeries in history, a great hoax. Unfortunately, we, Joseph Smith, church members, were the victim of this forgery. It began in a town in Illinois called Kinderhook. That's what they're named after. And a couple of guys got together and they said, hey, upriver, there's a Mormon prophet. Let's play a trick on him. And so they forged plates. There were 21 of them. They were shaped, metal plates shaped like a bell. And then they staged, so they went out, they forged the plates, they buried them, and then they staged a discovery party. And they invited a Latter-day Saint to the party. So they all go out to an Indian mound, lots of Indian mounds in the Midwest, and they just say, oh, yeah, let's dig around. Surprise, they find the 21 plates, and then they just set it up. So the Latter-day Saint gets all excited and starts to say, well, there were gold plates in the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith. And so the hoaxer guys say, well, could you take it to him? And so it works out about 2 months later. Long story short, the plates arrive in Nauvoo, and Joseph takes a look at them. Now, this is in May of 1843, and Joseph gets murdered a year later. So in May, we have a journal account from a person who was there when the plates came up, and he said, and he wrote in his journal, and this is one of Joseph's scribes, William Clayton. He wrote a big journal. He's known to be a good, reliable journal keeper. William Clayton said, oh, the plates came up today. Joseph looked at them. It also mentioned that Joseph had his Egyptian notebooks out. So they were looking at these forgeries as if they were Egyptian. And Joseph said, so the journal writer says, Joseph said they describe a guy in Egypt. And then it says Joseph would like to dedicate time and translate them. About 2 months later, they published a picture in the newspaper, the Nauvoo newspaper, of all of the plates, both sides. They did a little, which is good because the plates soon vanished. Joseph never got around to looking at them in any more detail. There's only one that's known to exist. It's at Northwestern University in their library in Chicago. And in 1981, a metallurgist, a metals engineer, looked at it. He's not a member of the church, and he's the one who determined it was a forgery. And he did it, by the way, I don't know how technical you want to get here. If come up later, we can talk technical. He discovered it was a forgery. It was pretty clear. But here's the problem. We were punked. We were duped. So that's a long time between 1840 and 1980. And so in the late 19th century, several Latter-day Saints published pamphlets and things where they said, Joseph translated from the Book of Mormon. There are lots of other metal plates that are being discovered. For example, the Kinderhook plates. So in our own literature, we were publishing and saying these plates are an example of ancient plates. So it was 40 years later in the 1880s, the guys confessed. They came out and they said, okay, it was all a hoax, we made it up. But then sometimes Latter-day Saints were kind of dumb. We were so committed to the story, we didn't believe them. And we said, oh, and we Latter-day Saints in the 1880s, 1890s said, no, you're just lying to make us look bad. We know these really are plates. And we kept writing about them in our literature, and it wasn't really until 1980 that there was a definitive hoax declaration. So they got us. Great question.
Oh, vale.
Back. I'll come around. Our chorister.
I was wondering, like, what should we know about church history when we're asked, like, what for on the topic of grace, what the reason for the priesthood authority and everything like that.
Great. He asked, how do we answer when people ask, what's the reason for the priesthood ban? How did it get started? Let's see, I got to make sure I don't have the back of my head, right? That's what. Are you okay if I take it off? I'll stand over here where I make sure. I don't want to get too excited and spit on someone. Okay, this is just a spit diversion while we get the camera lined up. One of my favorite parts of Hamilton is when King George just loses it. It's so hot on the stage. So, all right. So back to what do we say when people ask about the origins of the priesthood ban? This is one I'd like to give a little framework here. As you work through questions of history, especially complicated ones like this one of the things I like to do, and I will literally do this on a piece of paper. I'll draw a line down the center. I'll make 2 columns, or sometimes I'll do it on my word processor or something. But it's the action of one column is what we know, and one column is what we don't. Because again, things are missing, and so priesthood ban is a good one. This is a good way to help think about it, and so I'll kind of give the answer in that way. Here are the things we know about it. We know that during Joseph Smith's lifetime, black men were ordained to the priesthood. You've probably heard the names of some. Elijah Abel was one. Walker Lewis was another. There was a man who was the branch president in Boston who was black. And so it was known during Joseph Smith's lifetime, black men were ordained to the priesthood. Now, for Elijah Abel, we also have another record, one of the things we know. If you read the Doctrine and Covenants, one of the things it tells early saints is when you baptize someone or when you ordain someone, you're supposed to write out a certificate for them and say, I'm so-and-so, I have such authority, and I baptize you or ordain you, and now you're an elder. Well, the saints did that for the first few years of the church's history, and then it's just people walking around with a piece of paper. And so in Kirtland in 1834, 4 years in, Joseph Smith says, this isn't totally working because we're not totally sure who actually was ordained and who wasn't. So they did like a census, like an inventory, and they set up a committee. Joseph was the chair. They had scribes. They recorded everything, and they said to everybody, if you have ever been ordained, bring your papers in, and we're going to authenticate them. And so Elijah Abel brought his papers in to the committee. Joseph Smith and the committee reviewed them, and they declared them authentic. So one of the things that happened here, this is where people sometimes get it twisted around and they say Joseph Smith ordained Elijah Abel. He didn't ordain him. What it was this checking. But the net result is still Joseph, a black man appeared before Joseph, showed his papers, and Joseph said, yes, you are an elder. Later, Elijah Abel was ordained to additional callings. He also participated in Kirtland in the early temple ordinances. The endowment, as we know it now, was initiated in Nauvoo a few years later, but Elijah Abel participated in the Kirtland temple ordinances. So that's the second thing. We know that black men were ordained. We know that Joseph Smith knew about it and approved, and that was Now we know the earliest record we have of private conversations about black men and the priesthood occur in 1847. So Joseph, again, Joseph dies in 44. This is 3 years later. And in closed meetings, in minutes, we start to see people. Now, in one of these meetings, Brigham Young steps in and he answers, no, it's all right. Q. Walker Lewis is one of the best elders that we have. And so we have that in that context. The next thing that we know on our list of things we know is that in 1852, so it's 5 years after those closed door conversations, 5 years later, they are gathered to create the Constitution for the Utah Territory, the charter, the laws for the territory. They'd applied for statehood, it was denied, they were declared a territory, so they had to set the rules for government. In that setting, Brigham Young, as territorial governor, gives a speech, and he says two things. One, two important things. He says lots of things. Brigham says all kinds of things in his speeches. The two that are relevant here. One of them is he says, black men shouldn't be ordained to the priesthood. And then the second thing he says is, someday they will. And that's what we get from him in 1852. Now, they're in the context of the territorial legislature setting up the government. So the next thing we know is that people disagreed with Brigham Young, and they debated it. One of the most vocal was one of the apostles. His name was Orson Pratt. And Orson argued in this setting, no, they're people, they should be able to vote. And then Brigham has a speech a few weeks later where he says, no, they shouldn't have the priesthood. And in that setting, Brigham also invokes one of the ideas common in the 19th century, the idea of a curse of Cain that was perpetuated down. We could talk in detail. That goes throughout all of Western Christianity. The British Empire is dripping with these ideas about race, racial differences, United States. Brigham Young picks it up from 19th century culture, but he does invoke that. And he said, in this debate, in the context of debating with Orson Pratt, he says, no, this is because of the curse of Cain. And so that's the list of things we know. Now, there's some things on the other side of things that we don't know. One of them is what happened between 1847, when Brigham says, no, it's okay, and I know Walker Lewis, he's one of our best elders, and 1852, when Brigham announces that there's no priesthood ordination, that it would be banned or restricted. And there's an implication here. So we don't know. Did Brigham Young pray about this kind of the way we sometimes see revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants? Somebody has a question, Joseph turns to the Lord. There's an answer that comes kind of in first person in the voice of God saying, thus saith the Lord, do this. People have searched for that document forever and have never found it. So we don't have a document like that. We don't know, we don't have any meeting minutes. We don't know if this was something debated in the Council of 12 or the First Presidency. It doesn't show up there. All we have in the political context, but we don't have anything about where it came from. And that actually became an important part. If we fast forward and get to the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, one of the things that tripped them up as they wrestled with, well, what do we do with this, was this procedural question of where did it come from? How did it begin? Was it just a policy decision that somebody made? Was it a kind of a council meeting where they prayed about it and went on record? Was it a revelation that was written? They didn't know. And that part of the trouble in the 60s and 70s, and eventually the conclusion they came to was, we don't have a record of it, so we're going to ask for an experience that clarifies it. And that sets up the revelation in 1978. So that's kind of where we are, what we know, what we don't know about that decision and where it came from.
I have a
All right,
question.
let's take one on Zoom.
I have a question.
Terry Jensen. And I think, Terry, if you turn on your video, we'll see you.
All right, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right, I don't have a working camera, so I can't really show my video.
All right.
All right, so I had just a question about our canon in the Bible. I noticed that the Catholics had different books, such as the Book of Maccabees, and I was wondering why they're not included in our Old Testament.
Great question. The shortest answer is we basically picked up the Protestant Bible. The longer answer is there were debates for hundreds of years about what was in the Bible. The Bible didn't have a creation story like the Book of Mormon, that there was one moment when the whole thing came off the press and people said, oh, here's a book. The Bible was compiled, assembled over about 400 years. And we do not today have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. A letter that Paul wrote is long gone. They're copies of copies of copies. And so early on, maybe 40, 50, 60 years after Jesus' death, we start to see letters where people are debating with each other and they're saying, well, there's a bunch of writings, which ones are right? And they go back and forth and they split into different factions. Some people will champion one gospel or one book or one letter. Other people will say, no, that's wrong. It turns into kind of debates about who's a heretic, who's not. Some people get thrust out of the church. And it's not until about 300 years later that they start to settle on some ideas. But in big branches of Christianity, Catholicism and Protestantism, they go with different lists. And so latter saints of the 19th century are coming primarily from a Protestant culture in the United States, in England. And so they kind of pick up the King James version of the Bible, which in the 1800s, it was 200 years old, but it was a big translation project under King James. That's why it was named for him. And so that was kind of the common Protestant Bible. And so Latter-day Saints just picked it up. So that's why we have it. Joseph actually asked the same question. We've got a Revelation, the Doctrine and Covenants, where he comes on the Apocrypha, which is the loose term for these other non-canonical books or books that aren't in the Protestant Bible. Joseph asks, and the Lord says, yeah, some of them have good things in there. Read them with the Holy Ghost, and you'll be led to the things that are good. So personally, I have several Bibles that I study from, and one of my favorite study Bibles has got all of those books in there with the analysis. So. Sister Springer.
Hi. Okay.
Hey,
We have a
hello.
question about Freemasonry and the temple.
Great question. So, yes, Joseph Smith was a Mason. He joined the Masons in March of 1842, which was the same time, that very same month, they founded the Relief Society. And within that same span of weeks, he introduced the endowment in Nauvoo to a group of saints, to men and women. So one, yes, he was a Mason. Many people were Mason. Hiram Smith was a Mason. Lots of people in Nauvoo, lots of people in the United States. Today, it's smaller numbers of people who are Masons. 19th century is probably more common. And so, yes, Joseph was a Mason. He participated. So the Masons have a ceremony that they do, and people have long asked, how do these ceremonies relate to each other? I guess I've got kind of two layers of an answer for that. One of the layers is kind of at the nuts and bolts layer. The ceremony has nuts and bolts. People stand up, they sit down, they learn things, they progress, they learn something here, they learn something there, they shake hands. At the nuts and bolts layer, you can look at things and say, oh, wow, there are lots of similarities. You can do that too with any class at school. You can look at nuts and bolts of your physics class and your literature class, and you can say, oh, wow, they both have a teacher, and they both have chairs, and they both have tests. So it's not always compelling to say at the nuts and bolts layer there are similarities. So the next layer that I would answer that question is the two ceremonies, the endowment and the Masonic ceremony, have very different narrative trajectories, meaning they take you somewhere. You progress through, and they take you somewhere. The Masonic ceremony is a preparation for death, and it has a storyline about a character who dies and goes through and prepares for death. The teachings in the temple follow the same storyline that we teach in the scriptures, that we teach at General Conference. It's the storyline about the plan of salvation. It's the storyline about Jesus Christ and our redemption and the victory over death and the resurrection and the creation for life in the eternities. That's the message of the gospel. That's the message that we learn in the temple. And so at that level of the storylines, where the stories are going, what they're doing, the ceremonies are quite different. And so, great question. There was a hand in the back. Was there? Okay. Let's go right here. I'll come close and listen, and then I'll take it off to answer.
Okay, so I'm walking a fine line here because in 2019, First Presidency said not to theorize about the geography of the Book of Mormon.
Oh, right.
So I'm walking a fine line. But back we know that back in church history, the script was taken to a professor of graphology and sort of thing where he was able to tell that there were different authors. Do we use this graphology with some of the things that we think Joseph Smith said to figure out where the Book of Mormon was located? Because we do have the one, I do know one thing in the Nauvoo papers where they discussed how there were sites found in Latin America, and we were like, yes, that's Book of Mormon. But then we also have narratives of Joseph Smith walking through areas right into Emma saying, oh, this was a Lamanite site. So do we use some of the graphology techniques to figure this out? And are we certain that Joseph Smith said that the Book of Mormon took place in Latin America?
This is a great question. Let me ask a follow-up. I'll say it louder for everybody, but let me ask a quick question. When you're talking about graphology, are you talking about that term usually means handwriting analysis? Are you talking? But you're also talking about geography, right?
Yeah.
Physical location. So maybe it's not. Is it more the geography side?
So I'm talking about graphology.
Listen.
Written accounts supposedly from Joseph Smith, saying editor or whatever.
Okay. Okay. I know where you're going. Okay. So here's the question. The big question is Book of Mormon geography. Where did it happen? And she's very, very informed. She knows a lot about the different kinds of evidence that we have. And so I'll kind of restate some of the evidence in the big picture that we know. She started with a gospel topic that was published last year, January 2019, about Book of Mormon geography. And President M. Russell Ballard is quoted in there saying, we don't know where it was. Don't worry about it. Don't speculate on it. So, but this is Institute. We're free to speculate at Institute, right? Um, so we'll talk about it. Rather than speculate, we'll do what you do. Let's track through kind of the what do we know? What do we know about Book of Mormon geography? So there in the first, and I guess I'll do this by telling you a story of how what we as the saints thought about it has changed over time, because it has. So I'll start in the 1830s and I'll kind of walk us forward about how it's changed and why. I'll give you some reasons why. So when it started, early, first generation, the very earliest thing from people like Oliver Cowdery and others was kind of a de facto assumption. There was a hill in New York, and the plates came from that hill, so the civilization must have been near that hill. That was the starting assumption. They actually don't call the hill Cumorah until later. It's later that people say, oh, when Joseph talks about it, and you see this in the Pearl of Great Price, he just says, oh, there's a big hill near my house. And that's the way they thought about it in the 1820s when Joseph was translating, in the 1830s. And later, people say, oh, well, if the plates came from there, and then the civilization must have been here, and so let's call it Cumorah. So that name gets attached to the hill later. So that's one, there's a group of people, first generation saints just kind of have a default assumption. Now, the next thing that happens, while they're on the march from Ohio to Missouri, that's sometimes called Zion's Camp, sometimes is the Camp of Israel, but in the course of that march, they come upon an Indian mound, and they find a skeleton. They dig it up, they find a skeleton. The skeleton has an arrowhead in one of the bones, and then Joseph says, this was a white Lamanite. It gives a name, Zelph, you might have heard of this. And so that kind of resets people to think, oh, well, maybe there's something going on in the Midwest, maybe it's in addition to New York or different from New York, but it kind of stretches the view in 1834. Then, when they're in Nauvoo, one of the earliest books about the native culture in Mexico, and it was from kind of southern Mexico. Mexico kind of starts out large, and then it tapers down at the bottom. So down there in that narrow, tapered part of Mexico, and it's too early to call people archaeologists. Those disciplines are built later. They're explorers. They're people going through the jungle with machetes looking for stuff. And they stumble on these ruins, and they publish a book. And so a copy of the book, it's a two-volume book, two-volume thing. The volumes get sent to Joseph in Nauvoo by a guy in New York that is not a member of the church, but they're kind of corresponding. And the guy says, hey, I'm going to send you this book. You might be interested. So what we have from Joseph is a letter back to the guy in New York saying, oh, that looks really interesting. Yes, we believe that there were big civilizations in America. So that's all we have from Joseph about it. But what happens, the book gets passed to the editors of the newspaper in Nauvoo, and they publish 6 or 7 pieces over a series of months, kind of excerpting. And this is the way it worked in the 19th century. Everybody couldn't afford a book. You didn't have internet access. So the book would go to the newspaper, and then the newspaper editors would kind of publish extracts from it, and then add their commentary. The commentary is unsigned. So this is one of the big debates. And I think this is where the handwriting analysis comes in. People will wonder, and they have wondered, and we really don't have a definitive answer. There are excerpts from the book that we know, okay, that's from the book. But then there'll be a paragraph before or after that says, ooh, this is really fascinating. And they wonder, oh, who wrote the, ooh, this was very fascinating. But anyway, by the time Joseph dies, those are the 3 data points we have. We have a hill in New York, we have bones in the Midwest, and we have this book out of Mexico. 150 years later, that's all we have found from that generation saying anything. Everything else gets added later. One of the most influential things to be added later came in 1889 when they published another edition of the Book of Mormon. You know, we read published Book of Mormon all the time. It's been published numerous times. But the 1889 edition did something that previous editions hadn't done. It included footnotes. And these footnotes were stunningly specific. And it's kind of comical. I actually read all these footnotes a few years ago because I just couldn't believe it. So it'll read along, you'll read along and it'll say such and such at the river Sidon. And the footnote will say, this is such and such named river in Colombia. And like, where in the world did they get that from? But so you put it together in that book, in those footnotes, they mapped out across the whole hemisphere. So in 1889, footnotes of the Book of Mormon, Lehi lands in Chile. He migrates up through Colombia. Whenever it talks about a narrow neck of land, that's Panama. And then the book is kind of vague about how it gets to New York, but the footnotes of the book are vague in that way. They don't take those footnotes out for 40 years. In the 1921 edition of the Book of Mormon, the footnotes are removed. James E. Talmage is actually in the 12. He's the one assigned to do the 1921 edition. And he, as a scientist and an apostle, he says, where the heck did these come from? Get them out of there. But the damage was done. They'd been in there for 40 years of people reading the Book of Mormon, wondering where it happened. And so we really stamped it on ourselves for 40 years that they lived across the entire continent. Well, once they're removed in the 1920s, people then start asking different questions. And they do, and there's probably somewhere today like 40 different theories of where they landed. And people today go through and look at places and probably the best, so this will be my read, you know, President Ballard said, we don't know. But if I look at the evidence, the best summary of evidence is somewhere in Mexico, this kind of lower part of Mexico. It fits a lot of things we could talk in detail later, but it's so inconclusive. And one of the biggest problems with the Mexico theory or any other one is how in the world do they get to New York? And that's the problem that any other theory has to deal with. And literally, there are theories that place the Book of Mormon in Africa. There's one that places it in Malaysia. I mean, people have gotten really creative. But any one of those, no matter how far away you are from New York, one of the questions is, how do you get to New York? So one of the really stupid things that I have in the church history library is a map. And it's hand drawn. You've seen it. We've scanned it. It's online. It's in a million publications. But the why I say it's a stupid map is it's fourth hand. It's drawn by a guy who heard an old guy, who heard another guy, who heard Joseph Smith. And so that's the chain of where this map is drawn. So I have zero confidence in this map. But what the map does is it draws the Nephites down in Mexico, and then, it's just so convenient. The map walks Moroni, you know, because there's a part at the end, right? Moroni lives all alone. What does he do? So the map maker says, well, of course, he walked. And so Moroni walks up to Manti. He dedicates the temple site. And then Moroni was so good, he hit every one of the church history sites. He hit Winter Quarters, and he hit Jackson County, and he hit Nauvoo, and he hit Kirtland. I mean, it was just the best pre-church history tour ever. And he ends in New York. And so the map is saying that this. But so that's the piece. So many people from like the 1950s into probably the 1980s have published that map and said, look, here's how we solve it. It was in Mexico, and then Moroni walked. This is embarrassing. So you heard it here first. They're making videos of the Book of Mormon, right? You might be watching them, you might not be watching them. But they've shot the one of Moroni. And the latest version, which I hope doesn't make it, But sometimes filmmakers do whatever they want. They don't care about facts. But the latest version has Moroni walking through lots of different landscapes. So it's a film portrayal of this concept. So Moroni walks through Monument Valley, and he walks through the Great Plains, and he walks through a forest. And we're just like, no, don't do that, because that's, so, but I don't know what the filmmakers are going to do. So if you don't watch any of the videos, watch the Moroni one and see what they do with it. But we don't know. But that's where the pieces come from. So the latest piece, the latest probably piece to know as you worry about this debate is the Mexico theories, the Mexico analyses have gotten really sophisticated. They're multidisciplinary. They're archaeology and botany and geography and geology and history and linguistics. And they're like disciplines that no human knows all of these disciplines. And so they've gotten very, very technical, very, very, I mean, the latest book by one of them is literally this thick. It's a massive book where he lays out his Mexico theory. So we've had in the church a kind of populist, I'm going to use this word, sorry, it's a political word. It's a populist reaction that says, all of those experts don't know nothing, I know better. It emerged in the 1980s in kind of obscure corners. Right now, there's a very big group that advocates it. They sell tours, they sell books, they'll take all of the money that you want to give them. But basically, their argument is all of that scholarship stuff is too complicated. It's really simple. It happened in America because it's America. And their books open with pictures of the flag, pictures of the founding fathers, and they literally say, the promises about being the promised land couldn't apply to Mexico. They can only apply to the United States. And it's a really visceral kind of reaction. And they're the most vocal people on the scene right now. They're self-called Heartlanders. They place it all in the heartland of the United States. And it's America, red, white, and blue, and Nephites too. And that is where they're pushing. They have emeritus general authorities who will speak on their tours, but they're speaking out of, if you study rhetoric, this is that appeal to common sense, this appeal to simplicity, and they're just, that's the way they're framing it. So those are the two big camps, the Heartlanders and the Mexico crowd. That was probably too long of a story, but now you're ready. Zoom, save us. We got another one? You said Zeb? Lizette Martinez.
Hello.
Well, this is my companion.
Hi. So we're missionaries. But we have a question. Also, there's a guy named Joan, I think, that
is trying to get
trying to get a question answered. But we just had a question about the facsimiles in Abraham. We're wondering if you had any more information on those.
Yes. Okay. The facsimile in Abraham. Good question. And I'm guessing you're talking about facsimile 1, the round one.
Yes.
Well, kind of like all of
no. Well, the or the sacrifice one.
Yes.
One or two, or we'll take anything we can get.
Whatever you got.
So I'm going to show you. We'll show you. So we have two in here. We'll hold it up. I'll come closer to the camera. But one of them is this round one, and this is all we know about it. This piece of the papyrus hasn't survived. So all we know about it is this, and there's an interpretation here from the notes. That's what we know. This one with the sacrificial story, the guy on the altar, that one we do have among those 10 fragments of the papyrus that I talked about. And so it's kind of faded. Actually, this is another part. His arm faded out. So somebody with a pencil a long time ago drew his arm back in. It looks kind of goofy. When you find it online, you'll see people But so that one, both of them, Egyptologists have looked at them and they say they don't mean the things that the interpretation says they mean. So that's about all that I know. We can't really dig too much deeper. We don't totally know the process whereby Joseph gave the notes or the instruction. So it comes back to the same place we come with all of the other texts. You know, you can find some of the pieces in the fragments, some of the pieces in the notebooks, but lots of it, including the interpretations, aren't in his notebooks. So where does it come from? And that's the part where you say he's a prophet or he's not, or you pray about it, you work through. But in terms of kind of history and evidence, we don't have that kind of an answer on those. So you called out Joe. Who's Joe? You said Joe has a question. Sister Martinez.
His name is Joan. He's like a temple background. I don't know. He's like, I have a question.
I don't know if he's still on. I know.
Joan Grimmeth?
Oh, this is Eric.
Eric? We got lots of interpretations. Joe, Joan, Eric.
That's me.
All right. What's your question?
My question is, on my mission, the bishop's house. As for me, I always serve the other people to serve the people who need some food. They are support. They have come to the bishop's storehouse of my mission, give them a food they need.
All right, let me make sure I understood your question. I heard you talking about your mission at a bishop's storehouse and helping people with food. Did I get everything?
Yeah, I make and help other people need some food for their house.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your service. Helping people to have food is definitely an important part of what we do. And that kind of service goes all the way back to the Relief Society, to the early church history. Well, we're running out of time here. Will you put my slides back up? I want to show you all one slide. Did my computer go to sleep? No. Oh, yeah. Thanks for... Oh, yeah. All right. Well, let me show you something. All right. Gospel Library app on your phone. The first shot on the screen there is the landing page, the main library page. If you go down to the Nauvoo Temple one, that's the church history restoration section. When you click there, it brings the second screen that's on the slide. I just want to point out a couple things that are in here that are helpful. One of them, you won't see this on Zoom. I'm pointing my red pointer down in the corner. This one in the bottom, Gospel Topics Essays. If you haven't seen those, these are 13 essays that go in depth on tough questions from church history. So there's an essay on the Book of Abraham. There's an essay on plural marriage, 3 essays on plural marriage. There's an essay on Book of Mormon translation, Mother in Heaven. The tough things are here. This is kind of like the Dorothy moment in Wizard of Oz. They're right in your pocket. So had them with you. Go for it. A couple other cool things that are here. This one church history topics that's kind of in the center of the screen, there are almost 200. So the gospel topic essays are long. They might be a couple thousand words. And they're written kind of at least at a college level, and they've got footnotes, they're deep. The church history topics, there are about 200 in there. They were written to accompany saints. Volume 1, we published 116. Volume 2, we published another 60 plus. And those are written at the same kind of reading level as saints, but they go after all the tough topics. So there is, in the church history topics, there's one about the Kinderhook plates. There's one about masonry. And so they go into deeper things than things that we could talk about as we went along writing through saints. So there's about 200 there. And again, there's things about Lamanite identity. There are things about Indian slavery. In the Utah Territory, they enslaved Native Americans. There's a topic there. So that's another place to go if you want to just know, hey, what do we know about something? This is kind of scrolled down right across the top of Saints Volume 1 and 2, the Proclamation on the Restoration. But this is a great place to go. But the last one I would name, right at the bottom center, the global histories. We've started writing histories of the church in various nations. We've got about 49 of them in there right now. Another 50 are working their way through the publishing process. And so these are deep dives into the history of the church in all of the countries of the world. They have timelines, they have stories of saints. They'll talk about today, how many temples. It's a great place to just see what does the church history look like around the world. All right, I'm going to say something here, but if you are so inclined, I'd love for you to help me. I've asked the people, the church has a little research department. They've put together a little survey. You can scan it, the QR code with your phone's camera, or you can just use this little URL and it'll pop up, I don't know, 5 or 6 little questions. A couple of them are, was it more likely or less likely, those kind of questions. But several of them are just open boxes where I'd love to hear from you. And this is why. I've done this, you're actually the 5th time that I've done this. And we're just trying to figure out how do we share what we know about church history? So if this was helpful, let me know. And then we can set up other times, other people. There are 250 employees in the church history department, and I'm not the only one who knows things, and we might send other people around. But let us know if there are things we can say or do, or if we can help. I'm going to close with one question you didn't ask me, but it's probably the question I get asked most often. People will say, well, second most often. Most often one is, do you have the sword of Laban? And the answer is no, I don't. The second most often question is, people will say, is there anything you can learn from church history that would make you lose your testimony, that would challenge your testimony? And the first, I've only worked for the church for 6 years. The first time, and I never got this question as a history professor in Texas. I don't know why. But the first couple times I got this question, it was weird to me. I just thought, that is a really weird question. Why are you asking me that? And I actually had to think about it for a little while until I realized something about myself. And this is what I realized. No, I don't think I could learn anything from church history that would challenge my testimony. Not because I'm a superhero or because I have some kind of crazy, strong testimony impervious to anything, but my testimony didn't come from church history. My testimony is about my relationship with Jesus Christ. My testimony came the way that I think every testimony has to come. I read things. I learned things. I prayed. I learned about how God answers prayers. I recognized in my own experience those answers. There are times in my life when I am absolutely certain that God was communicating with me through the Holy Ghost. My testimony comes from that. I do lots of things every day at work with history. I never gained a testimony from history. And so I don't think history could take away a thing that it never gave me. And so if I could close with any comment there's lots of things we can learn and do and say and speculate and wonder about history and sources and records. And that's fun. I think it's fun. I do it all day long. I enjoy it. But the things that matter deepest to my soul aren't things that I read in a history book. They're things that I experienced when I felt the peace of the Lord in my mind, in my heart. I told you about the one experience where I was struggling with race and racism and oppression. I didn't get an answer that solved those questions, but I got a communication from the Lord that He knew me, that He knew I was wrestling with those things, and that He wrestled with those things and He wept with them. One of the ways that we become like Jesus, which is our goal, we often talk about be baptized like Jesus, be good like Jesus. Well, we also become like Jesus when we mourn like Jesus, when we weep, when we comfort those who need comfort, when we listen. And some of these topics, that's what we do. We listen, we mourn, we seek the peace that comes to our mind, to our heart. And I know that God lives. I know that He knows you because He knows me. And I know that if you reach out to Him, He will respond to you. And I give you this testimony, my testimony, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you.
After we finish, I will stay here until there are no more questions left. And we can work it out by Zoom. We can work it out in person. I do know that sometimes you don't want to ask your question in front of everybody. And so I have a hotel in the neighborhood. I'm here until we're done. So it's been a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Brother Erekson, for your efforts and for being here. We've all been enlightened and grateful. And if you have other questions, I hope that you will ask him. And if you don't have the time tonight, I hope you'll seek for other opportunities. He's coming back to Boise on August 5th, so there will be other opportunities to ask other questions.
Right here.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. I kind of have a 3-part question that all runs into itself. First of all, when do you determine that research for the time being is completed? Do you have evidence that you wait to show the world until that you have like in the vault and everything that you haven't announced yet that you have? Wait until the investigation is complete, and what's the latest new thing that you have completed research on?
Okay. Me personally, or the church history department as a whole?
Whichever's more interesting. I don't know.
Okay, so first question. When is research done? It never is. It's just always ongoing. And for a variety of reasons. Sometimes new sources come up. So, people literally walk into the library, well, in the olden days when we were open, they would literally walk in every day and say, I found this in my grandma's attic. It doesn't mean anything. And so we're always finding new sources. And we ask new questions. Right now, for some reason, people are really interested in the Spanish influenza and what happened to the church in 1918. So new experiences then send us back to the records and the stories, and we go back and look for things. So the research process is always ongoing, which I think is good. Every generation needs to make sense of the past for themselves. Your second question was about when do we release things? Generally, we try to release them as soon as we know they're okay. Now, sometimes that doesn't work out so well. There was a time in the 1980s when there were a lot of forgeries on the market that ultimately all traced to a single forger. But they kind of were authenticated, at least people thought so. They were really sophisticated forgeries, and they did a lot of damage for a while until the community, the community of professionals and historians, experts, and really it was the forger messed up and got arrested, and part of his plea bargain, he had confessed to all the things he forged. And most people were stunned that it was that many. So sometimes, we like to release it as soon as we're confident. Sometimes our confidence is misplaced, but that's just part of that process of study. The most interesting thing I've personally worked on lately was that Elvis Presley Book of Mormon. It was in our collection for 30 years. People said it was Elvis's handwriting, had annotations all over as if he had read it and was kind of responding to the book. And anyway, the short version is it wasn't his handwriting, and it was forged. So that was fun for me to do that work. And I still get emails from people, say it ain't so, please. I want that story to be true, but it's not.
Yeah, Daniel
Newville.
Well, I don't have a mic or a camera. Can you?
I can hear you.
You can hear me. Good. All right. I don't have a camera, unfortunately, set up, so I cannot grace you with my face. But I'm curious, can you briefly go over the history of the Catholic Church's claim to priesthood authority? Thank you.
Wow, that's a big one. Well, I would say the briefest version of that is twofold, or two parts. One is the story, the tradition that Peter made his way to Rome. And then second, somehow in there, the Bishop of Rome became, and it's the connection to Peter being in Rome, that the Bishop of Rome became the most prominent among the bishops. So they were all bishops in that sense, but the Bishop of Rome was the most bishoply of bishops. And then that became the legacy then to the Pope and Rome, Vatican City. That's a really, really, really short and abbreviated version. But you asked for the brief one. But that would be the link that they make. What's the next one?
I don't think it's the apostle, but it's Neil Anderson.
Neil Anderson.
Nope, not the apostle.
All right. I was afraid he was checking up on me.
Yeah, I just had a question about coffin canes and how like there was a story once that like Joseph, like they had to fake his death, and like they made canes out of the coffins that they gave to his closest friends. I was just wondering if there was any legitimacy behind that or what the story is.
Yes, that is a true story. So let me give you the details. When Joseph was murdered in Carthage, they took his body back to Nauvoo. And so the coffin that we're talking about is that one. In Carthage, the words of the time call it a rough-hewn coffin, which just means you go out as fast as you can and you put the boards together and you make something to put Joseph's body in. They took him back to Nauvoo in that box, that wooden box. And then in Nauvoo, his body was cleaned and prepared for burial. And so then they had the formal kind of burial after his wife and others had, family had their farewell. So those pine boxes that were used from Carthage to Nauvoo, one of them they cut up and they made, we don't know the exact number, but it's probably about 24 canes, walking canes. out of that wood, and they gave those to people that knew Joseph. And so some of those are still around. It's cheap wood, so a lot of them are not around, but there are a few, and yeah, that happened. Some people made them nicer. Some people put handles on them, and so the ones that survived are a little bit more elaborate than just the basic. But yeah, true story. Great souvenir if you had it.
I have something I'd like to say.
Hello.
I was just wanting to say that with what you were saying about like the race and the priesthood, I just had a scripture that I thought would help with that. I believe it's 2 Nephi 26, and it basically says like all are like unto God, both male and female. Yeah, sorry, I don't have it completely memorized.
You're right. That's a great scripture, and there are many passages throughout the scripture that speak to the fact that Jesus redeems everyone. So yeah, thank you. Did we have Keely on there?
Yeah. So I had a question. So I'd seen that there was research that was done with it was a woman who was redoing George Watt's Pittman shorthand and taking the notes that were actually taken versus the Journal of Discourses. And she noted that there were some pretty significant differences, and I found a couple of things that have her discussing it, but what more has been learned about that? What more have we learned about maybe Brigham Young himself versus the person that's presented in some differences and similarities?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. We can go really in depth on this one. I'll start kind of high level and maybe leave it there. Yeah. So her question is about some. Well, I'll just kind of tell the story that leads up to the question. In the 19th century, there's no audio recording, there's no video recording. And during Joseph Smith's lifetime, there's nobody who can write as fast as humans speak. So in Joseph Smith's lifetime, we don't have any speeches. You know, in courtrooms, they'll have a stenographer who can write that fast, but none of the saints could do that. But shortly after Joseph passed, a clerk came in by the name of Watt, George Watt, W-A-T-T. He was a convert from England, came to Nauvoo, and he had the ability to write a form of shorthand called Pittman, named after the person who invented it. And it's basically dots and scratches and curves, but he would sit during a speech, and not in Joseph's lifetime, it's later, during Brigham Young's presidency, and make all of these scratches on his paper to record what was said. Well, there came a point where George Watt said, you know, I have to have a job. I have to take care of my family. I can't just sit around and record you speaking all day. But the brethren said, well, we want recordings of the speeches and you have the skill. So they came up with the idea that Watt could publish the speeches and sell them, and that would become his livelihood. And so what he published became known as the Journal of Discourses. It was a 26-volume set, and there were other scribes that also knew shorthand. But so her question is about, we have recently in the church history department been transcribing all of his shorthand. There's like 3 people on the earth today who know how to read Pittman shorthand, and we've hired one, and her name is Legine Carruth, C-A-R-R-U-T-H. That's where you can search for her name in BYU studies or places where she started writing about these things. And what she's done is, we've got the Journal of Discourses that were published. She's gone back to the Pittman shorthand and translated what the shorthand says. And then she compares it to what's in the Journal of Discourses, and she's found, in some cases, really significant differences. Whole passages in the shorthand notes that aren't published, and vice versa. Things that there's not even a word about it in the shorthand notes, and that there are paragraphs in the Journal of Discourses. And so we just last week, we put another batch of her transcriptions online in the Church History Library catalog. And so you could search for them in the catalog as Pittman transcriptions or whatever, but she has written in BYU studies, and we're just in the earliest stage of analysis of looking at what's in the notes, what's in the Journal of Discourses. Ultimately, the big question is, what did Brigham Young say? And we may never totally know, but we can at least say these are in the notes, this is what was published. Yeah, today it works a lot easier. I guess I should have told you the last piece. The speakers didn't speak in the 19th century from prepared texts like they do today. They just spoke off the cuff, and so you had to. This is literally all we have, the shorthand. So it's kind of a cool project, what she's doing, and we hope we learn more. So, Brennan.
Hello, I just had a question. Did Emma Smith really try to poison Joseph Smith? And if so, why?
Well, that's a good question. The short answer is I don't know. We don't know. We don't totally have the sources. So I can't say she tried. So then the speculation on why is one step removed. Emma's an interesting person from our history. We do not have a journal from Emma. We have maybe 24 letters between her and Joseph. Later in her life, she did a couple of interviews. So we don't. She's a person I want to meet someday, because we don't know much. We don't know about her inner thoughts. We don't know about her feelings, her reactions. It's just very, very slim, the records that we have. We know a lot about her externally. That she moved with Joseph. She was in a place. She was the Relief Society president. We've got a couple of minutes in the Relief Society of some speeches that she gave. But again, they didn't have somebody who could write fast enough. So it's Eliza R. Snow kind of writing a synopsis of what Emma said. So it's really hard to know Emma's thoughts and feelings. And she had to be amazing to do what she did. And I look forward to meeting her. So. Elder Barron.
Hi. I had a quick question. So in church history, from the beginning of the Restoration into where we are now, what has kind of been like the change in the prophetic role in the church? I don't know if that question's too vague, but
yeah. So the question about change in prophetic role from the beginning. This is probably one that's got kind of two halves of the answer. There are certainly things that didn't change, that haven't changed in the prophetic role. I mean, and at its core, a prophet is called by God to speak to the people on God's behalf. And so that part of the relationship remains. We have a prophet who communicates with God, who shares that message. Probably the other side of the answer is at a kind of tactical level, administrative level, and there have been all kinds of changes in the ways that prophets administer things. I mean, Joseph begins with a congregation of maybe 60, and so everybody in the entire church knows the prophet firsthand, face to face. In that setting, people go to Joseph. The Doctrine and Covenants is filled with revelations where people came to Joseph. They said, what should I do? What does the Lord want me to do? And those revelations always start, thus saith the Lord to my servant so-and-so. And so that is certainly not a role or relationship that we have today. But so administratively, things have changed as the church has grown, as communication methods have changed. Prophets are able to communicate. I mean, right now, one of the cool things that we're kind of seeing with President Nelson is he just being active on social media. When did we have a president of the church who had a platform? For example, his recent statement about race and racism and racial harmony, I mean, that was really quick that he was able to get on Instagram and post a reaction. And so At that level, there are lots of changes, but behind it all, the continuity is that there's a prophet on the earth, and that is really amazing. So. Emily.
Hi, sorry, this is actually Brian. So my question is, I kind of have two questions. The first question is, what is the history of the high security vault, essentially? Like we hear about the vaults in the mountains and things like that. And then the second question is, what are some of the most interesting things that are currently in the high security vault that most members wouldn't really know about?
Oh, great question. So the history of that particular vault is the one we mentioned briefly. It was built in 2009. Before that, and continuing, there is the Granite Mountain Records Vault that's up a canyon just outside of Salt Lake City, built into the mountain, kind of like an atomic bomb shelter, built in the 60s during the Cold War to endure Armageddon. And we've put things there, different things there over time. Before that, we kept records in the church office building, the big tall tower. That opened in 1971, and there was a place in there where we stored things. Before 1971, the records were kept. There's a little building behind that tall tower called the administration building. And today, that's where the First Presidency offices are, a tiny little building. That opened in 1917. So from 1917 to the 70s, the records were there. Before that, they were in a little house across the street. Some of our most precious records, in fact, Emma Smith carried in her skirt. And so they have a long history. So today, what's in the high security vault? We keep Joseph Smith's papers there. They are unique, and so they're kept there. We keep the minutes, the records of the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, the kind of more confidential things there. Mostly what's in there, well, we keep some glass plate negatives in there, which is just a fancy way of saying in the 19th century, they took photographs on glass. And today, 150-year-old glass is so fragile. We've digitized them, but we just put them in there so that nobody accidentally bumps the box. And but then probably the most interesting things that are in there would be the high dollar items. And so one story that people know, that they don't know the end of the story, in Missouri, the first time they tried to print the Revelations, they called the Book of Commandments. And that printing press was destroyed by a mob. And young girls went in and grabbed the pages. There were a handful of girls, took them out in the cornfield and rescued the pages. That's the part of the story we tell in primary lessons or something. I'm interested in the other part of the story. Well, what happened to those pages after you rescue them? Well, here's what happened. If you know 19th century printing, they would print a big piece of paper that might have 16 pages of a book on it. So what the girls rescued were these big sheets of paper. And then you would fold them down and cut the edge and bind one, and it would become the book. They were sequenced in a way to become the book. So they took all of the pages the girls rescued, they brought them back together and reassembled them, and they were able to create 29 versions of the Book of Commandments. I say versions because none of them are the same. This one's got mud on this page, and this one got torn on this corner. So all 29 are unique in their pages. They're also unique in their covers. So the pages were then distributed to people, and different people would put a cover on them, and they would bind them. So some get bound rather simply, crudely. Some get bound more elaborately. But we've tracked down all 29 of them still survive today in 2020. Most of them are in libraries and archives. And so, but like of the 29, I think 8 of them are still out in private hands. Those are the ones that move around. The institutions usually just keep them. But so it's probably 8 years ago now, was the last time that one of these copies of the Book of Commandments went up for sale. It went up for an auction. And 7 years ago, it sold for $2.1 million. This one little incomplete book rescued by those teenage girls sold for $2.1 million. So in the high security vault, I have 6 copies of the Book of Commandments on one shelf. So I've got arguably now $12 to $20 million on that one shelf of just copies of the Book of Commandments. Some of mine are probably worth more than the one that sold. Probably the one that I have that's most valuable was Wilford Woodruff's copy. And he did 2 things. He bound it, but he signed the front page, so it's got his autograph. And then the cool thing that he did, in the back, the Book of Commandments publishing happened before Joseph received what is now Section 89, the Word of Wisdom. So in the back, Wilford Woodruff wrote that one in. And so he was, in his personal copy, trying to keep up with the revelations. And so that one is probably one of the ones that if we would never sell it, but if we did, that would be one that would probably yield even more than the others. So those are the kinds of things that are there. So yeah, I always tell people, if I didn't have a high security vault, if I just left a $2 million book sitting on the table and it walked away, then I would be on YouTube for being an idiot and losing a $2 million book. Now I'm on YouTube for having a top secret high security vault. Ooh, that's spooky. So you just have to figure out why you're there. But we're there to protect the records. Right here.
Why Elvis was still so later on, so far down the line, and also specifically why
Right. Oh yeah. So you asked all the big questions about plural marriage, records about plural marriage, and particularly in Joseph's time. My first answer there, the best place to go in those gospel topic essays. I said there were 3 about plural marriage. One of them is plural marriage in Nauvoo. That's the one where we present everything we know. And then I'll say a little more about it. The second one is plural marriage in the Utah Territory. That's after it's publicly announced. In Nauvoo, it was mostly secret, but not a very well kept secret. It was known. Second essay is kind of the public era of plural marriage. And then the third essay is how plural marriage ended. So to your question about the Nauvoo one, the biggest problem we have in answering all of your questions is lack of sources. It was kind of, we have only one record from the 1840s, from the Nauvoo era. It's in Joseph Smith's journal, and it's actually written in shorthand. You can see it, so it's dots and scratches. And that's the only marriage that was recorded at the time, and that was recorded in his journal. All of the others, the records come later, and literally the trigger for this was in 1868, 69, Joseph Smith III, Joseph's son, who had stayed in Iowa, he came to Utah and he started giving public lectures. And basically it was, the truth about my dad. And one of the things he said was, my dad never practiced plural marriage. And so that's all a lie that Brigham Young and people have invented. So in 1869, Joseph F. Smith and others start going around and documenting. And they bring people in, they bring women in, put them in front of a justice of the peace or somebody, and they sign affidavits. They give written statements, they sign them. And so that's when our records start. It was in the 1860s, but we're 30 years later. And so it's hard to retroactively go back and imagine what they were thinking. Now, one piece of context, so that's kind of like the immediate record of plural marriage. But if we kind of move out around context context. This gets at the question of mothers and daughters. And with Joseph Smith, there's also women who are married to other men already. So we look at that and say, what's going on? If we go out to a little bit wider part of the context, we see that they looked at sealing differently than we do today. And I can tell you when the change happened. The change happened in 1894, so it's 50 years after Joseph Smith. Wilford Woodruff is president of the church. He gets a revelation. The temple, Salt Lake Temple, had opened the year before in 1893. This is 1 year later. And Wilford Woodruff says in the revelation, we haven't been doing sealings totally right, and we need to make it right. And the right way to do it is to seal a person to their parents, to their grandparents, and seal a chain all the way back to Adam. That's the language he uses. We'll seal the whole family all the way back. And then they start the Utah Genealogical Society, and that's when the church begins to gather genealogical data. As a church, people had done it individually, but as a church, kind of systematically, that's when it began. So if they change it in 1894 to what we do now, what did they do before 1894? The way that they look at sealing, and I'll use it, Wilford Woodruff used the vertical. Let's go all the way back to Adam. Before that, they looked at it more horizontal. It was more like a social network. It was who you're connected to. And so some of the marriages, and in this case, the women who are married to other men, that was the motive. It was, let's be connected in a web of connection. There were not marital relations or conjugal relations between Joseph and women married to other men. So that's one of the ways we have to kind of tweak our head and say, okay, they were being connected. And so we get people, women sealed to multiple men, we get men sealed to multiple women in that, and they're kind of making connections. Now, it doesn't explain everything about Joseph's plural marriage, because he does have other wives where they do have conjugal relationships, sexual relationships. And so, but it's part of the context, at least that they were looking at it differently than we look at marriage. The other problem we have, frankly, in the 21st century, to think about plural marriage, is the Victorian ideal of marriage intervened in the 1880s. And I'm talking about Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, this whole generation of writers who start writing in the 19th century about marriage as, well, it's like our story, right? There's the one person out there, I'm going to find them, we'll get married, we'll be happily ever after. That's a new story. That Jane Austen is really the first generation of people who are describing marriage in this way. And when Jane Austen, I've read Jane Austen with my daughters, when they're talking about, well, I don't want to marry this guy, I want to marry someone else, I want to have a choice in that, they are literally part of the generation where they're saying marriage used to be about economics and we want it to be about choice and personality, but they have to make that revolution. Now that's all over. We just assume that's how marriage works. But in the 1830s, 1840s, marriage is working for economic reasons, it's working for political reasons, it's working for kind of social networking reasons, and so it's just kind of a different thing. Yeah.
I mean, Emma's father didn't want Joseph marrying Emma.
Right. No, Emma's part of that generation who, I mean, it's mid-19th century, Emma's early, that's going to say, no, I'm not going to do that. So yeah. Go for it.
Okay. So you guys have talked about Emma and her. You're not sure whether or not she was the first sealing. Is that correct?
Okay, so if you're talking about sealing, well, so here's where they don't use the word sealing until later. And they don't totally use that word. Anyway, let's go this way. The first plural wife was probably in Kirtland. Records are a little bit fuzzy. By Nauvoo, we start to get multiple. And there is, and it's torn here. Joseph had, it's not totally clear. Joseph had civil authority in the political economy. So it's not totally clear early on, because today we'll sometimes talk about sealing as a religious ceremony, but Joseph was also working in a civil context. So it's blurry. But anyway, somewhere in there, Joseph comes back to Emma after there are other wives, whatever the relationship was, and they do a more ceremonial, temple ceremonial type. But again, they don't have the temple. The temple's not finished till after Joseph is dead. So it's hard to take our current word and stamp it. But you're right in the timeline. They're married civilly early on, and then they do have later, after Joseph has other wives, a ceremonial thing as well. So, great question. What was the point of the plural marriage before the temple? You've got kind of an assumption in there that the plural marriage, see, today we look back and we've got marriage embedded in the temple, and we just think, oh, marriage, temple, sealing, marriage. They haven't revealed and developed all of those things. They are. They use the term differently. I mean, it means different things to them. Yeah.
It's a celestial marriage. They're binding themselves together through eternity, right?
Yes. The part about binding, connecting through eternity. It's hard to know if it's marriage, kind of marital relations through eternity, or just link through eternity. That's the part where they're, and sometimes it is more of a marriage kind of relations, and sometimes it's more of a link, but we don't have enough data to know these were the marriage ones, these were the link ones, these are why. That's the part that's still lost to us.
So when Joseph is accused of committing adultery with somebody.
Right.
So his comeback is that we were married, correct?
Well, sometimes. So Joseph gets accused of adultery lots of times. He gets accused of lots of things, lots of times, many lawsuits and accusations.
Not for, like, they had good reasons for accusing him.
Well, so some of the accusations are just wrong. He says, no, there's nothing, and that's accurate. There wasn't anything. Sometimes the answer is no, we are married. Other times the accusations of adultery are, well, I guess those are the two times. Some of them, that's not at all. Well, I guess a third variation. There's a guy in Nauvoo named John C. Bennett. He makes accusations, and he uses a term, and this gets into the documents. He says Joseph is practicing spiritual wifery. And so it's John C. Bennett who introduces that term. And in those cases, Joseph's response is, I've never taught spiritual wifery. I don't know what you're talking about. John C. Bennett invented spiritual wifery. The other half of that is, we do something different.
When it comes to whether accusations against Joseph Smith or against any of the early church leaders. And so it just seems like there are people that in one instance will quote from Brigham Young in one thing, and in the very next sentence or two, they completely deny what Brigham Young has said. So why is it so ambiguous? Why can't we just come to a conclusion? I understand that's very tricky with history especially, but what I don't understand is why we can, like the Journal of Discourses was used for a very long time.
Yep.
And now the church is kind of backing out of the Journal of Discourses.
Sure.
Like, why is it always in favor of the church use this when not in favor do not use the same thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can I, is it okay if I kind of step back with kind of a framework and then come back here? Here's the way I like to think. I mean, you're getting at the core problem of history, and is how do we know stuff about stuff that's gone, that's over? You know, they're dead. How do we know things? And history as a discipline, as a field, is different than other disciplines. You know, in science, they create modern experiments and you replicate them. And so there's a sense in medicine, you do clinical trials and you repeat those and you, but history is not a discipline like that. And here's maybe the way to illustrate it. So we've got today, July 15th, 2020. We're all alive today, but no one of us experiences everything in July 15th. The day is huge. We're all here, which means we're not other places. You're going to go home, you're going to read the news, you're going to check Facebook. You'll learn a couple other things about July 15th. So we take the big circle of July 15th, and immediately it gets really small that a person only experienced part of it. Then the next thing that we lose is, so I experienced my whole day. Am I going to record all of that? No person has ever recorded every single thing that happened to them in a day. And so we go from the whole day to what was experienced to what was recorded. Then we lose all kinds of things that get recorded. They get burned, they get thrown out. The person keeps their stuff for 50 years and then their kids just throw it out because they don't know what it is. So it happens. So then we go down to what's lost. And so basically you can see where this is going. We have a giant thing of the past, that spring day in 1820. But today we have 4 specks from Joseph Smith, and every single thing from history is like that. And this is the problem. In schools, they teach us that we know everything. George Washington thought this, and Lincoln thought that, and we never really teach people, well, we don't totally know. And so one of the things I think happens that's unfortunate, the first time a person learns, oh, we don't have all the sources and some of them contradict, it's about the Journal of Discourses, or it's about the First Vision, or it's about the Book of Abraham. And so they go at it in a church context, and we really need to go at it in a history context, because everything's like that. You know, Abraham Lincoln left 5 accounts of the Gettysburg Address, and they're different. We never teach that in school. We make kids memorize one of them. We've picked one of the 5. And if we would teach people that all of our knowledge is like that in history, then I think it prepares us for, because I feel what you're feeling, and I felt it a lot. It's like, can't we just know stuff? And sometimes we just can't. And it's frustrating. And engineers hate it. Are you an engineer? Okay, my dad's an engineer, so I'll make fun of engineers. All my brothers. I'm the oldest of 7. But engineers hate it because they just want the mathematical formula that shows how to build the bridge, and I'm done. And I'm like, no, history just doesn't work that way. I can build maybe the guardrail to the bridge and tell you it might be a bridge, but that might be all I can get. So,
why don't we use that same logic for the Book of Mormon?
Great question. Who do you mean by why don't we?
Church historians, anybody who considers themselves an expert in the Book of Mormon, I would even say like the leadership of the church.
So let me try and figure out what you mean, because the Book of Mormon, we have a text that was published in 1830. We also have what we call, so we have 2 handwritten versions of the Book of Mormon that are earlier than 1830. The first one, and they get named funny names. The first one we call the original manuscript because it was the first one. That's the one Joseph dictates, the scribes write, and that's the original manuscript. The second one, when they finished, Joseph learned he'd lost the 116 pages. So when they finished the original manuscript, Joseph made Oliver copy the whole thing over again. And it was the second copy that they took to the printer. So that one gets named the printer's manuscript, and the original manuscript. So here's what we do talk about in the church. The original manuscript was put in the cornerstone of the building in Nauvoo. Water got in, the building caught on fire. 50 years later, they pulled out what was left. And we estimate we have about 28% of that original manuscript. So we don't have the earliest draft. The printer's manuscript was kept by the Whitmer family and ultimately went to the Community of Christ. We bought it from them a few years ago, which, by the way, I thought it was a great deal. Here's how it worked. A bunch of rich people gave $35 million to the Community of Christ. The Community of Christ gave me the printer's manuscript, and I gave those rich people a letter that said, thank you. What a deal. And they got a tax write-off for what they had donated. So we have the printer's manuscript, and then we have the 1830 edition. Now, there were, there's a long story that's going to get to your answer. They did another edition of the Book of Mormon in 1837, and it's different than the version in 1830. Joseph made corrections. Then in Nauvoo, they did 3 more editions in 1840, between 1840 and 1842. So in Joseph Smith's lifetime, we have 5 published versions of the Book of Mormon and the 2 manuscript versions, the one that's mostly gone and the one that's nearly there. We keep all of those in the collection. In 1981, when the church put out a new version of the Book of Mormon, the current one we have, the little blue one, they added the subtitle. They went and looked at all 7 of the texts from Joseph's lifetime, and they made changes in the 1981 text. If you get a previous Book of Mormon to 1981, there are changes. And the changes were made by looking at those other 7 and trying to figure out. Now, you can't always figure it out. You could just go and say, well, the printer's manuscript is the earliest one, so we go there. But on the printer's manuscript, when they did the 1837 edition, we have in Joseph's own handwriting, him crossing words out and making changes. So do you go with 1837 Joseph or 1829 printer's manuscript? That's Oliver making copies, a copy of it. So it's definitely a process of reconciling. They're still there. That's probably way too complicated for a Sunday school lesson. If your question is, why don't we say that in Sunday school? I don't know. But definitely at the level, I mean, your question is, why don't church historians talk about it? And my answer is, we do. We preserve it. We use it. Why don't the brethren talk about it? The committee in 1981 that reviewed all 7 was Thomas Monson, Bruce R. McConkie, and Boyd K. Packer. Those were the committee who, they reviewed the 7. So that's where I was getting to your question of nobody talks about it, nobody knows about it. No, we know about it, we use it, we preserve it. Well, so I think you're going to like, is it an ancient text or modern text?
Well, I mean, we talked about where's the Book of Mormon.
The geography?
Geography.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, we have scholars in and out of the church that discuss these things.
Right.
And if we apply the same logic that we use for the history of the church to the general history of the Book of Mormon, and also apply not only a historian's view, but an engineer's view or the archaeology, like we can come to some sort of conclusion, I feel like.
Yeah, probably not as good of one as you want.
And what I guess I want to see is that the church says something about it and says maybe things will change in the future that will enlighten us.
Yeah.
But their stance is very ambiguous in itself.
Right. Well, and I think the stance reflects the ambiguous stance about geography or historicity. It really does reflect, if I wanted to go in, so a historian of translation, well, like what we're doing on Journal of Discourses, if we said, this is what was published, let's go look at the shorthand. We can't do that with the Book of Mormon. We could say, this is what was published, but we can't compare it to the gold plates. So that's where that kind of historical analysis breaks down. We can go back to the original manuscript, but then it's just a cliff that drops off into blackness. There's no, we're totally cut off. So the geography people, they work from two directions and neither one of them works. If we go back to the bridge analogy, you can start from two sides of the chasm, but we can't make it line up. One side would be, and we do this with other texts, ancient Greek texts, ancient Egyptian texts, you read the text and the text tells you something. You know, the Egyptian text says, we planted by the Nile River. You say, oh, I know what the Nile River is. The Book of Mormon doesn't work that way. There's no word in the Book of Mormon text that launches us back to a place. And so the other way to do it would be to start from a place. This is the archaeological approach. Let's dig in the ground. Let's find a column with the inscription, welcome to Zarahemla, or Nephi was here, or whatever. And that part we haven't found anything in the archaeology. So the text to land doesn't work. And so far the archaeology, it's all, there's no archaeology that's yielded a solid finding. It's only people piecing it together. And this is really how they go. There's a mountain, you know, they're reading the text. There's a mountain and there, a neck of land and a river. And they literally go on the map and say, well, here's a mountain, here's a river. And it's all kind of parallels, but we're in the realm of parallel. We're not in the realm of, you know, I found a city and it has a name. Please. No, I tell you, everybody, there are people in the room that want to know the same thing. So thanks for asking.
So, as much of an official church answer as you can give as a church historian, can you tell me whether or not the Book of Mormon is a history of a people or is it a revelation to Joseph?
Wow. Yes. I mean, I think the best answer is that Joseph, through a process which he didn't describe, whenever anyone asked him, how did you translate the book? He always gave the same answer. I did it by the gift and power of God. That's all he's told us. So that's where it comes down to for me. I've got a prophet working through a process which he's telling me is not the normal translation process, which makes sense because he didn't speak. I mean, the first problem is he doesn't speak the other language. Today, translators speak both. So what I've got is the book, what I've got is his story, and what I also have, me personally, in my particular case, you know, my first testimony experience of the Book of Mormon came when I was 12. My family read the book. It was long before I even studied anything in history. My family read the book. We finished. My dad does the thing, you have to go pray about it. So I did. And I had an experience there that is truer and stronger and more real than anything. Now, it doesn't answer everything, but that's the part of the answer I know. And a lot of times people will say, well, this much I know from history or science or whatever, and I'll take the rest on faith. Frankly, whenever I hear that, I cringe because I think it's backwards. I don't think faith is the leftover patch that you put on stuff that doesn't make sense, because that's not what the scriptures teach. Well, no, let me tell you what reality is. And I'm going to use that word reality. The scriptures teach that faith is evidence, that faith is the substance of things that are not seen. And I'll go right back to the Book of Mormon, Alma chapter 32. When you plant the seed and it sprouts, Alma says, is this not real? Do you not now know that the seed sprouted? And so faith to me, and what I think the scriptures are telling me, faith is a real thing. It is real substance. And it drives me crazy when people talk about faith as the patch that's left over. I know everything over here because I'm so smart and I have to take this on faith. But the scriptures don't talk about it that way. And so that's where I've put my anchor, is that I've had real experiences and they are real. And there are other things that I don't know, but there are things that I know and that are real. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Do I still need this on? Is there anybody on Zoom? We still do? Okay, I'll keep it on. We have 50? 50? Wow. Okay. I'll stay with it to go in there. I just feel like I'd rather sit down and just talk, but we'll go this way.
I studied a lot about different historical things, but one thing that I've always wanted to and I've never gotten to is the purpose behind Joseph Smith and the presidential campaign.
Oh yeah. Why did Joseph run for president? Good question. One question people ask is, did he think he would win? Probably not. Obviously he was murdered during the campaign. They didn't send him any Secret Service bodyguards or anything. So what was he doing? Well, couple of things. We've always had a two-party system in the United States, two dominant parties. They were different too in the 1840s. We had the party that is today known as the Democrats started out being called the Democratic Republicans, and they had both of those. And their competing party was the Whigs. So Joseph was in that context. In the 1844 election, he wrote to multiple candidates from both of those parties. I think it was 5 or 6. And he told them, so this is 1844, he rehearsed to them what had happened. We lived in Missouri, they took our property. The Constitution says that you are free to exercise your religion. We were expelled from the state because of our religion. The governor signed the order. We took it to the President of the United States, Martin Van Buren, in 1841. He said he couldn't do anything for us. So, dear candidate, do you believe in the Constitution? Do you believe that it protects the practice of religion? And what would you do to protect the minority in our society? Several of the candidates didn't write back. Those who did just said, I can't do anything for you. I mean, the same kind of answer. And so I think part of the rationale was Joseph was on a kind of publicity campaign. Going to President Van Buren was trying to make people know that we've suffered, we've lost our property. They published what they lost. The scripture I quoted at the beginning about gathering up the history, they were gathering those things, they were publishing, they were making people known. And so probably the best interpretation of his candidacy is in this publicity campaign to say, the current administration won't help us, none of the candidates will help us. How do we get our message known? And so that became a mechanism. He announced for the presidency, he writes a pamphlet, they send people out to talk about his candidacy, and then it was cut short. So, but it's kind of a fun little story that he announced. Okay.
True that we are the only group of people that the U.S. government has put an extermination order against?
So you ask, is it true that we're the only people that the U.S. government put an extermination order against? I would say no, but I'm going to get really precise. It was not the U.S. government, it was Missouri, the state. Yeah, well, I mean, in the U.S. government system, we have tiers of government. The big term we use is federalism, and so we can't call it a U.S. government because it's not Congress, it's not the executive branch, it's not the Supreme Court. Our problems with Congress and the executive branch of the Supreme Court come later over plural marriage in the 1870s and 80s, but it's not in the extermination. So So yes, we had a statewide extermination order, but not a U.S. government order. I don't know if that's any better. I mean, is it better that someone different is trying to kill you? But yeah. We have another Zoom one?
Yes,
Ashlyn.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
And
I'm Justin. My wife, I'm using her Zoom account. But anyway, I appreciate your answers and the time you're taking to answer questions after the official meeting. Yeah, so I do have two questions. Hopefully they're real brief. So the first one is, why was the Lectures on Faith pulled out of the original Book of Commandments, or what we now know as Doctrine and Covenants? I know that there was some discussion I read about James E. Talmage seeing it, and perhaps there being some confusion in the doctrines and not necessarily incorrectness. And then my second question is, on the church's website and on the LDS app, there are only records of general conferences going back as far as 1971, but we do have print records going back as far as the 40s and 50s, 40s and 30s, I think. So I was just curious about that. Thank you in advance.
Yeah, two great questions. So we'll start with the Lectures on Faith. You mentioned the Book of Commandments. They weren't included there. They were included in 1835 in the book Doctrine and Covenants. And when they prepared it, they called them the doctrine, and they called the revelations the covenants. So at one level, by taking them out, we need to call the book the covenants. That's what the historical purists would say. But so they were in the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835, and you're also right. They were pulled out in 1921 by that group that James E. Talmage led as they went through the scriptures. And that's when they were pulled out. And they were pulled out then because there were questions about their origin, which they didn't totally know how to answer in 1921, but they just wondered kind of where they came from, what they meant. But they clearly saw in 1921 that they had a different origin story than the other revelations. And so in 1921, the action was, these revelations are mostly pretty clearly to Joseph, although we have like meeting minutes of the Kirtland High Council and other things in there, letters, but those all had a clear tie to Joseph, and they weren't totally sure. Now, fast forward to now, the general consensus is that probably Sidney Rigdon wrote the Lectures on Faith. Answer, because there isn't totally one, but that's a good example of just trying to understand more. Now, the people who defend the Lectures on Faith say, well, it was published when Joseph was president, and if he didn't write them, he at least knew. There were a couple of revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants that weren't authored by Joseph Smith, or a couple of documents in there. But anyway, so that debate has gone on and on and on. But I guess the net result was they were pulled out in 21, and they're still out. And the more we learn about them, the less likely that they would be put back. So I just need to move away from that. That's what's happening, huh? Okay, second question was General Conference before 1971. I actually get asked this question a fair amount because it's kind of odd. It's kind of a weird year to do it. First, the historical answer. The church has had conferences since 1830. The first one was in June of 1830, and they held them regularly. The first regular record keeping of General Conference was in 1899. So we do have kind of transcripts of talks all the way back to 1899. Now the website answer, you're gonna have to forgive me, I'm gonna have to get a little like techno geeky. Do we have any computer people, techno geeky people? The one who asked is our techno geeky guy. Okay, so you'll appreciate this. So when people try to design computer systems, they want the structure to be parallel and uniform. They hate computer systems where everything's all crazy, which is like how history works. So General Conference, we had General Conference, but what happened in 1971 is the church magazines changed the way they reported conference. Before 1971, in the improvement era, they would publish General Conference talks all over. Conference would be in April. There'd be a few in the May issues, some in June, maybe some in August. And the techno-geeky people hate that. But what happened in 1971, they redid the ensign, they redid the they created the ensign, it started in 1971, and they redid the publishing schedule, and they said, if conference is in April, we're publishing the whole thing in May. If conference is in October, we're publishing the whole thing in November. And the computer geeks love that because it's a system, it's a pattern, they follow it, they did it, and we've literally gone over and said, we have General Conference back to 1899. And it's the geeks who say, nope, that's too complicated, we don't want to do that. So it's the geeks ruling the world. I'm sorry, that's what, but in the Church History Library catalog, we've got the improvement era, we've got the conference. I mean, it's there, they're out there. They're just not in the clean, pretty way the geeks like them. So there you go. I'm glad nobody in the room said they were a geek, since I kind of talked about geeks.
Thank you.
Tim, oh, there you are. There's our friendly smiling geek.
Hey, I've got a question. How has the philosophy of church history changed since the beginning of the church? I guess what I'm getting at is, you're talking a lot of detail here. Is it just that we're still learning all these things, and that's why there's so much more coming out, or has the philosophy of what should be public changed over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the biggest change in the philosophy of talking about history, there's probably a way to mark this as a turning point. And that was with the publication of the Joseph Smith Papers. We started working on the Joseph Smith Papers 2005, 2006. The first volume was published in 2009. But that was the first time as an institution that we made a commitment to, and I'll throw out some jargony terms here that you can care about or not care about, but what we're doing is an activity called source criticism. And we've kind of talked about it already. It's the idea of saying, let's look at all of the different sources, let's study them closely, let's make them parallel. What's the manuscript, what was published? And that was a change, that's a recent change, that's in all of our lifetime, that as an institution, we felt comfortable. So let me give you as an example. We have cases, well, the Book of Abraham is an example. Joseph translates the Book of Abraham, and then he says, well, I don't need the papyrus anymore because I've translated it. And so he gives it away. That today, we wouldn't let people do that in the church history department. We say, you can't do that. But so you can see, but in the 19th century, the philosophy was more, whatever the end product is, that's what we keep. And in fact, so I told you about the rich people who paid $35 million for the manuscript. In 1903, the Whitmer family sold it to the Community of Christ. But they approached our church first. They approached Joseph F. Smith and they said, we would like to sell you the printer's manuscript for $1,500. And Joseph F. Smith turned it down in 1903. And his rationale was, why would I want the rough draft if I've got the final published version? And it was just talking about philosophy, an approach to history. The 19th century approach was, however the sausage gets made, you keep the product. In the 21st century, we're saying, we're kind of interested in sausage. Let's look at it and see what we can glean. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that there was a philosophy change. So I'm glad. I probably wouldn't have had a job in 1903 with that approach. So my kids are happy. AMIK is your screen name. AMIK.
Yes, that would be me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name's Amick, and my question is, you referred back to the articles of, not the articles of faith, the
lectures on
lectures on faith, and
Yeah.
you said that the more we learned about that, the less it's going to be more likely to put into scripture. What have we been learning about it?
Well, so basically what we've learned is that it was probably authored by Sidney Rigdon. It was used in the School of the Prophets in that classroom. So then it just becomes a question. I know we have some seminary and institute people here who might love their manual, their teaching materials, but are teaching materials the same level as scriptural materials? And I think the consensus is emerging. Those were instructional materials. They use them in the class. They helped people think, but that they're different than the scriptural materials. And so that's kind of the trajectory of the thought. So, but who knows? Maybe we'll put all the institute manuals in the standard works, and we'll just have so many scriptures that. No, I'm just joking here. But that's really the short version of the rationale as they parse out what do they think is standard works, scripture, and what are other teachings and other materials, support materials. So.
All right, thank you. That answered my question.
Questions around the room? Let's go here. And,
I have a few.
oh, good.
Okay, so in today's world, we see this idea of alternate history and alternative points of view come about.
What about alternate? Are you saying like, what if JFK didn't die, alternate history, or just like I disagree with your interpretation, alternate view? Okay.
But really, with church history, we're starting to see podcasts come out that talk about, alternative perspectives or alternative views or different documents that people have and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
So I guess my question with that is, and I think maybe it would help to understand how sources are chosen to create a viewpoint in history, but how do we discuss and talk about those things and help people come to a conclusion?
Yeah, that's a great one. You could do your whole history career studying that. It's a really big question. Maybe the shortest version to say, we put less stock in the totally what if alternatives. What if Lincoln had lived? What if there was no atomic bomb? And why we don't go there is, so I'm smart enough to ask the question, what if JFK wasn't murdered? But I have nothing, after I ask that, there's nothing to base it on. And so it becomes purely just, kind of conjecture and fiction. And people write fun fiction that's like, what if that didn't happen? So kind of traditional or normal history doesn't go that angle, like the total what if alternative. Now at the level of alternative sources, alternative interpretations, that is totally what we do. And there's probably, history doesn't have, some disciplines have a really good body of material and practice about evidence. So law is one discipline. If you go to law school, you're going to take a course on evidence, and you'll walk through all the rules of evidence and what counts and what doesn't, and what's hearsay and what can be admitted and what can't be admitted, and the rules for making something. History doesn't have that. We don't have that kind of a discipline around what is evidence, and in some ways it probably hurts us. But there's kind of some rules of thumb. And as we kind of debate back, well, here's my source, well, here's your source, well, here's my interpretation. There are a couple rules of thumb that we follow. But all of them they all have exceptions that make them not very good rules of thumb. So here's one. that we prefer a source from a participant rather than somebody else. And so intuitively that makes sense. So we'll go back to Hamilton. I want to hear from the people who were in the room where it happened. And that's where I'm going to find, if it's somebody who was far away or just heard about it, I'm going to go there. Now, the exceptions there is sometimes the people in the room where it happened didn't write anything, or sometimes they don't say anything, or sometimes they contradict themselves. So it's not an ironclad rule. If they were in the room, that's the truth. But we lean more that way if they were there. But we still have to kind of analyze it and say, well, when did they write it? And did they write something else later? Or what was their motive? So it always is a kind of analytical, interpretive process. But that's one of them. Another rule of thumb is we like it closer to the event than later. We talked about this a little earlier. If you heard Joseph Smith speak and you went home that night and wrote it in your journal, that's probably better than if 40 years later you told your grandkids and they wrote it down. But the exceptions to that rule of thumb are multiple too, right? Some memories, like trauma, get suppressed and come out later. Sometimes you write something in your journal and then it's later somebody asks you a question and it triggers, oh yeah, when I was there I had, and so is the one that was triggered later more correct than the one that, and so they come. So the short answer is it's always interpretive. There's just not a way around interpreting it. And I think we hurt ourselves when we tried to say, people say, well, let the facts speak for themselves. Well, they just don't. We're always interpreting. We're always, and we have to interpret because things are missing, because things are contradictory. And so it's an interpretive deal. Great.
Okay, these may be a little more fun.
Oh, that was fun. Every one of these has been fun.
I grew up in Texas.
All right, where?
Tyler, Texas.
Tyler, okay.
So thank you for
Yeah.
but question for you, as you've studied church history, what have you learned about the process of revelation?
What have I learned about the process of revelation from my study of church history? I'll say one interesting thing I learned, and this is probably one I learned recently that I just kind of hadn't thought about. But here's one way to illustrate it. If you take all of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants and you put a date on them and make a chart, of what year has how many revelations, and you do that, what you see in the Doctrine and Covenants is it's front loaded. 1829, 1830, 31, 32, 30, and then 32 it starts to dip, and then 35 it drops off, and then by the 40s there are just a few, and then we have the official declaration in 1890, and then number 2 in 1978. So if you just look at that chart, you would say, wow, we had a burst of revelation and then it went away. That might be one way you'd interpret the chart. But if you look closer at some of the turning points that I named, 1832, 1835, something significant happens to the way they talk about revelation, the way they receive revelation, and I think it really informs if we want to talk about revelation in the church today. In 1832, the first presidency was organized. Before 1832, if you want to know what happened, what was going on, you had to talk to Joseph. That's all the structure there was. In 1830, when the church was organized, the entire structure was 2 elders, Joseph and Oliver. And so 1832, the first presidency is organized. 1835, the Quorum of the 12 is organized. And so we see then a shift to a concept of revelation of let's go ask Joseph and he asks God and we write a thing. A concept that when those who are called by God meet in council and prayerfully consider things and make a decision about things, those things, and there are scriptures in the Doctrine and Covenants that talk about this, when they're gathered by the Spirit, when they speak by the Spirit, those things are the Word of God. And so we see that kind of implanted onto the system of the governing councils. And so this is why people say, well, when was the last time that the church received a revelation? you'd probably say, oh, last Thursday when the Council of the 12 met and had their, because we have, and they now increasingly, I appreciate that they talk about things. When President Nelson introduced the proclamation, he said explicitly, this is from the First Presidency and the Council of the 12. He's invoking that method of revelation. It's not a method. We often sit down and think, oh, the prophet must sit alone in a room and pray. And he does. President Nelson prays. He's also talked about how he prays. But there's also a way that the church receives revelation through councils and through a more participatory process. So, yeah.
And I have two, but I'm choosing.
Okay.
So one of the fossils, I can hear it in my head, I can't remember who though, said that wants to know the future, he just simply needs to look to the past. And so I guess my question for you is, in your studies of church history, as you dove into everything, what is something as an individual member of the church that I can be on the lookout for, or be better aware, more aware of that will help in the future?
Wow. I'm going to give you a two-part answer to this one. One that I believe and one that I don't believe. I'll start with the one I don't believe. People often say that history repeats itself, and that if you don't learn lessons, you're doomed to repeat, whatever. I don't believe in that approach. There's too much complexity, too much variation over all of the scope of history. So I don't believe that, and I can't tell you, well, if you look at 1737, that's going to be repeated next week. That part doesn't work. People have tried. They've tried it at societal levels. They've tried it at nation levels. They've tried it at personal levels. And there's just too much. The problem with there is human agency. People make different choices. They respond to different settings in different ways. And it's very different. Now, the other part that I do believe in, I do believe there are prophets who lived in the past, who made prophecies, who recorded in Scripture, Isaiah, Daniel, Joseph Smith. If by looking back to the past, if we're saying, what did Isaiah say about the latter days? I think that's a great place. What did Mormon write about the latter days? That's a great place to go. It's harder to say, oh, here's a story in the book of Jacob, and the parallel today means this will happen. But if Mormon or Moroni is telling me, I've seen your day, and here's what I'm warning you about, then that's definitely something to pay attention to. Or if Isaiah is saying, I've seen the last days, and I'm excited about this, then that's definitely something to look for in the past. Yeah. We have any on Zoom? Nope. All right. You're up again.
I'd like to say something.
No, don't be sorry. That's like saying, I'm sorry, I'm a disciple.
So we've already talked about that we need to have faith first and build upon these evidences. And so your church history, library, all of this stuff. How many different types of evidences? Sorry, I have the word in my head. How many?
It'll come back.
Academics do you have? Like you have historians.
Oh, yeah.
Anthropologists and biologists. Do you have like a wide variety of people?
Yeah.
And secondly, kind of.
Do you want a job?
Yes.
Okay. I could tell that's where this is going.
But also, I'm curious because, like somebody like history, I like to have a lot of that background supporting it. But you talked about how we have the largest collection of anti-LDS works. Do we have people who focus just on that and just on the relief site and just on, or is it kind of a
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Let me start with the first question. What disciplines do we employ in church history? So my degree is in history, PhD in history. We have several historians. They probably tend more to be in the Joseph Smith Papers project. In that project, we also, several of them then get a subspecialty in documentary editing, which is this kind of careful analysis of sources. So maybe I'll just go around some of the places. So in the library, the people who work for me, I have librarians, I have archivists, I have there's another profession called records management that deals with more modern records and some of the risks. Most often records managers are in corporations and hospitals, and so I have some records managers in there. I also have some technologists, some technology geeks that build our website and catalog, so there's a technology component. I have some writers, I have an editor, and he's got a degree in editing. He taught writing and editing at a college. I have a lawyer who works for me. My boss is a lawyer, the church historian, Elder LeGrand R. Curtis, member of the 70, is a lawyer. We have some lawyers around. So then next door, across the street, we have the Church History Museum. And so we have people with museum studies degrees. And we have, I have conservators in both the museum and the library. We've got conservators. They will subspecialize, so people will conserve paper or photographs or textiles. So the textiles people in the museum, the conservators in the library are more the paper and photo conservators. We've got some AV, audiovisual people. These are the geeks who know all the kind of reel-to-reel and 16 millimeter, and they know everything about audiovisual. Let's see, we've got a historic sites division. That's where things get really funky. These are the people who manage Nauvoo. And so there I've got some kind of museum, kind of interpretive people. We've got an archaeologist there who runs the cadaver dogs over properties looking for bones and human remains. We've got people who, I hope you're getting a sense that basically across the scope of historical interest, we hire people. We don't hire like biologists or botanists or scientists. The church has never had an archaeologist running around looking for Nephite lands. But yeah, so we've got a lot of them.
How did you go about then, like managing, realizing Elvis, like Elvis?
Oh yeah.
Like you didn't have a graphologist.
Yeah. Okay. You keep mentioning graphologists. So I'll tell you what people in the profession think about graphology. They think it's bunk. And especially the angle where it's like, if you write this, I'll tell you your personality. So that part we stay away from. The people who really professionally specialize in handwriting are more often in law enforcement. And you know, the FBI has a forgery division. The guy who ultimately cracked I talked about some forgeries in the 1980s. The guy who cracked those was a law enforcement, and they're into kind of microscopic analysis. So graphology is more like the shape of your curve, but of the loop of the letter. The professional they're called forensic document analysts, and so they're more into the pressure on the paper at the microscopic level, and so they're hitting things with ultraviolet light. They're looking at multispectral imaging, and so we have some of those. We have a multispectral camera in the library, but so on the Elvis one, what I ended up doing, I studied it enough to say it's fishy, and then I sent it out to 5 different handwriting analysts separately, and all 5 of them independently judged it to be a forgery. And so that was ultimately my handwriting analysis wasn't me; it was those analysts that I used. So. Not at that big of a level. So, so like I have a librarian who catalogs all of the anti-Mormon literature. So she kind of knows it by cataloging it, and she's entering the title, but she doesn't really read them all. She doesn't, we'll dig into them when we need them, but she's not assigned to like just sit and read them, which would be a pretty terrible job. But it's more like we collect it, we catalog, we save it, and then at some point, and there are lots of reasons we've looked at them, but we're not like reading them all steady. So, but yeah, different archivists will, and it becomes just kind of personal. They'll specialize in something. So I've got one archivist who's gotten really good at recognizing 19th century handwriting. I mean, she can look at a document and tell you which one of Brigham Young's clerks wrote it. It's a Brigham Young letter, but she'll say, "Oh no, that was Thomas Bullock. He was the scribe." Because she kind of knows them like people. She's been employed for 44 years, and she knows them like friends, and she's just been in. So yeah, it kind of, but that's more personal. We don't structure it that way, but through the work she's done, she's known those kind of things. Yeah, no, we're always hiring people with advanced degrees, terminal degrees. I mean, I hired an intern the other day with a PhD. I mean, and that's kind of job market function right now. The market's not so good, you probably know. But yeah, so we've been lucky that the market on our end, the market is saturated, and we get to choose really talented people. So. Yeah. Michaela. Michaela Schmidt.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know you were talking about me. So I was wondering, one of my favorite parts in the Book of Mormon is it at the very end when Moroni is talking and he says, if these spiritual gifts shall be done away, it shall be because of unbelief. And something I just noticed when I was reading some of the Joseph Smith history or just, the times that he lived in is it seems like a lot of these spiritual gifts were a lot more evident, a lot more obvious. And I was just kind of wondering, I only know of a few stories of like how people were able to see angels or I don't know, maybe they were able to define these gifts a little bit easier. I guess I was just kind of wondering how we could do that in our day, or if it's possible for us to do things like that in our day. I don't know. I guess.
Yeah, great question. I think what has changed is probably just the way or the openness that people have to talk about them. In the Joseph Smith papers, I mean, there are meetings where people are speaking in tongues, they're doing all kinds of things. I think people talk about them differently today, is one angle. I think the other angle, well, let's see, what was the other angle? I think the other angle is that it's just the church is larger. It's huge. There are a lot of people. So we can go and hunt for the people in Kirtland, and there might be 500 or 800, and we can find out who had an experience or what their experience was. But today we've got 16 million members, and so. But with both of those difference, the size difference and the way we talk about difference, the important thing that's not different is spiritual manifestations are alive and well in the church. Some of the places, sometimes people will talk about them at General Conference. Sometimes you'll see them in church magazines. Sometimes they're in the Ensign, in the Latter-day Saint Voices section, where people are kind of telling their story with things. I pointed earlier to the global histories in the Gospel Library app, where we've been writing histories of countries. there are many, many stories of people in countries, and some of it is culturally based. I served my mission in Brazil, where they are a very visionary people. People often have visions and dreams. It was not uncommon to show up with an investigator and have them say, you know, oh, I had a dream last night about something, and we're like, well, yeah, that's really cool. You know, African cultures, some of the African cultures, and there are a variety of cultures in Africa, but some of them are also very visionary. And so I think it's out there. It's out there in different ways. Missionaries experience the gift of tongues a little bit differently today than in the past, but they experience it. And so it might just be kind of broaden what you're looking for and where you're looking. Another great place to hear it, and I don't know, I hope I don't offend anybody here, but I get the most exciting stories out of new converts. You know, people have been in the church forever, they're old and stuffy and they don't want to say things. But new converts are just excited and they're like, hey, this happened to me. And I'm like, that is so awesome. So, I mean, it's there, it happens. Another place you hear it is at funerals. A lot of times as people are ill, as they're near death, they'll often use a phrase like the veil is thin, but there are people with visitations and manifestations and experiences. So it's definitely part of our scriptures teach, and it's part of what people experience today. It's really exciting.
Thank you.
A seminary teacher texting. Is he under 60? We did set that. Okay, all right, we did set that. Yes, I have. So the question was, have I ever held the seer stone that was photographed? I have. And this is going to tell you more about me than about the seer stone. But when I had it in my hand, it didn't do anything. So Oliver Cowdery and I, we've got something in common. We do have other seer stones in our collection. There were lots, not lots, but you know, a dozen people had seer stones in the 19th century, Latter-day Saints. Most of them are still in families. I think we've got 3. We've got pictures of others. And then we literally do have a box of rocks that nobody knows what they are. That's one of the problems with rocks. They don't tell you what they are, but there's no story or no attached to those, but I guess nobody dares throw out the rocks just in case. Yeah. Do it.
Okay, why do we let Ken Sanders talk so much at the Antique Roadshow? Why don't we send somebody from the church to handle that?
Why does Ken Sanders talk at the Antique Roadshow?
Why don't we send somebody who's pro-LDS?
Oh. Well, there's probably a couple of dimensions. One dimension, and this is one I talk about with my staff regularly. You know, we get training in history or whatever, but the church doesn't necessarily, I mean, they pay me a salary, I get dental insurance and all that kind of stuff, but the church doesn't do that. They don't make that investment for me to become like a celebrity or to go on to Talking Roadshow or to, I mean, they like me to be involved publishing, but they like, I mean, why there's a church history library, why there are historic sites, why there are publications like Saints, is to build the kingdom. And so there are times when I'll say to my staff, yeah, that's probably a distraction. You know, there are times where we study things and it works and it helps, but so Antiques Roadshow isn't really a place where we've thought like, oh, we'll go build the kingdom on Antiques Roadshow. Yeah. I think the other part is I know Ken. That's Ken's business. He sells books. He's got to get out. He's always looking for ways, and I think he's been more proactive in trying to say, "Can I be on your show?" Whereas we're not proactive in that same way. Yeah, and it kind of gets back to, I mean, yeah, I don't know. If we have somebody analyzing the Journal of Discourses versus identifying what's in someone's attic, we're kind of like, well, let's analyze. I mean, it's part of it's just shortage. We can't do everything, so we're always kind of saying, well, where do we put our attention? So, yeah. Well, did that do it? I know we have one that we definitely want to follow up. Well, what is that? 11 o'clock? One more? What I did my dissertation on. I wrote about people who commemorated Abraham Lincoln. So the people I studied were 20th century people. They were collecting Lincoln stuff. They were putting up monuments to Abraham Lincoln. And I was exploring what they were doing and why they thought history mattered. So, yeah. So my book about that, I did write a book. It's called Everybody's History. So if you want to know why people in the 20th century studied Lincoln and you want to go to sleep, that's a good one. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to everyone on Zoom. And we'll see you next time. Find me on social media, Twitter, Facebook, wherever. If you have a question tomorrow, let me know. I'm going to turn this off. Bye-bye, Zoom.